The telegram trembled in Clara Hawthorne's gloved hands, its words sharp as winter steel. Send her back, too stubborn. Boston's finest finishing schools hadn't prepared her for rejection delivered in 8 brutal words. But as the Wyoming wind howled through the train station's cracked windows, something fierce ignited in her chest. Not shame, but defiance. She'd crossed half a continent to escape suffocation, and she'd be damned before crawling home defeated. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. Because what happened next changed everything. The Greystone Station matchmaking office smelled of old paper and dashed hopes. Clara sat rigid in a ladder-back chair, her spine refusing to touch the wood, while Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the territory's most notorious marriage broker, shuffled through a diminishing stack of letters with the enthusiasm of an undertaker sorting coffin sizes. "Well," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone proven right, "I did warn you Mr. Henderson preferred a quieter disposition." Clara's jaw tightened. Quieter. The word men used when they meant invisible, when they wanted a woman who'd nod and smile while they made every decision from breakfast menus to life's entire direction. She'd watched her mother perfect that particular disappearing act for 27 years, shrinking herself smaller and smaller until Boston's proper society barely noticed when she finally faded away completely. "He sent me back like defective merchandise," Clara said, each word precise as a scalpel cut. 3 days. I lasted 3 days before he decided my opinions on irrigation systems were too forward." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows climbed toward her steel-gray hairline. "You discussed irrigation? With your intended?" "His plans would have wasted half the water. I merely suggested—" "Suggested?" Mrs. Fletcher removed her spectacles, polishing them with the slow deliberation of someone gathering patience. "Miss Hawthorne, you've been in Wyoming territory for 1 week. Mr. Henderson has ranched this land for 15 years. Perhaps, and I'm speaking from 3 decades of successful matches, perhaps a bit of feminine deference would have saved me from myself." Clara stood, her traveling dress's bustle swishing with the sharp finality of a closing door. "I didn't cross 1,800 miles to become a decorative silence. If that's what Western men want, they should advertise for porcelain dolls, not mail-order brides." Through the office's frosted window, Greystone's main street stretched like a promise half-kept. False-fronted buildings huddled against the endless Wyoming wind, their weathered wood the color of old bones. Mud churned where the January thaw had begun its tentative work. This wasn't Boston's cobblestones and gas lamps, its suffocating parlors where women spoke in whispers and died by inches. This was raw, honest, brutal in its refusal to pretend. And Clara had exactly $17.32 to her name. "I understand you're disappointed," Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone gentling slightly. "But you must understand there aren't unlimited options. The men who send for brides are often particular, set in their ways. They want helpmates, not equals." "I was going to say complications." Mrs. Fletcher settled back into her chair, the wood creaking under her considerable frame. "Let me speak plainly, since you seem to prefer it. You're educated, well-spoken. You have opinions on everything from water management to women's suffrage. Yes, I heard about your conversation at the boarding house. These aren't necessarily virtues in a frontier wife." Clara moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Outside, a woman struggled past with 2 children clinging to her skirts and a third strapped to her back. Her face was weathered beyond her years, but her spine was straight, her stride purposeful. She wasn't fading. She was fighting. "What are my options?" Clara asked quietly. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the office's Franklin stove crackling and the distant sound of someone hammering at the blacksmith's forge. Claire could feel the weight of Mrs. Fletcher's assessment, that calculating stare measuring her worth against an impossible standard. Finally, 1. Clara turned. "I'm sorry. You have one option." Mrs. Fletcher pulled a letter from the bottom of her desk drawer, not from the stack, Clara noted, but from somewhere it had been deliberately hidden. "I wasn't going to show you this one." "Why not?" "Because Luke Carver isn't like the other men who advertise." Mrs. Fletcher laid the letter on her desk like it might bite. He's had 3 mail-order brides. 3. The first lasted 2 months before fleeing back east. The second made it 6 weeks. The third, Lord help her, packed her trunk in the middle of the night and walked 12 miles to town in a snowstorm rather than spend another day at Cedar Creek Ranch. Despite herself, Clara's interest sharpened. What did he do to them? Nothing. That's precisely the problem. Mrs. Fletcher pushed the letter toward Clara. He didn't beat them, didn't starve them, didn't rage or drink or gamble. He just was. Luke Carver is half wild, Miss Hawthorne, more comfortable with wolves than people. They say his ranch is so isolated you can go weeks without seeing another soul. The silence drives women mad. Clara picked up the letter. The handwriting was surprisingly neat, each letter formed with obvious care, as if the writer wasn't accustomed to writing and wanted to get it exactly right. I need a wife. Ranch work is hard. Winters are brutal. I'm not good with words or company, but I'll provide for you, protect you, and never raise my hand to you. If you can handle isolation and honest work, Cedar Creek Ranch could be a good place. If you need society and soft living, look elsewhere. Don't come expecting to change me. I won't come expecting to change you. L. Carver. Clara read it twice, then a third time. There was something in the blunt words, the absolute lack of poetry or persuasion, that resonated like a tuning fork against her ribs. He sounds lonely, she said. He's impossible. Mrs. Fletcher leaned forward. The other women called him the wolf, said he'd go days without speaking more than necessary, that he'd vanish into the mountains for supplies and leave them alone with nothing but wind and wolves for company. They said it felt like living with a ghost. Or living with someone who doesn't pretend. Mrs. Fletcher blinked. I beg your pardon? Clara set the letter down carefully. Every man I've met, in Boston, on the journey here, even Mr. Henderson with his irrigation follies, they all perform. They put on shows of what they think women want to see. Charm, manners, pretty words that mean nothing. This, she tapped the letter. This is the most honest thing I've read in years. Honest doesn't mean suitable. Neither does charming. Clara met Mrs. Fletcher's gaze steadily. You said I have one option. Is this it? Technically, you have 2. You could return to Boston. No. The word came out harder than Clara intended, sharp enough that Mrs. Fletcher's expression flickered with something that might have been understanding. For a moment, the marriage broker looked less like a stern gatekeeper and more like a woman who'd once made her own difficult choices. Your family? Mrs. Fletcher asked quietly. Clara's fingers found the mourning brooch pinned at her collar. Her mother's, the only thing she'd taken from that suffocating brownstone where her father's disappointment had hung like coal smoke. My mother died teaching me what happens when you spend your whole life being what others need. My father died angry that I refused to learn the lesson. There's nothing for me there except becoming exactly what killed her. The office fell silent again. Outside, the hammering stopped. A dog barked. Someone laughed, a sound bright and free and utterly out of place in Clara's churning thoughts. Cedar Creek Ranch is 40 miles from here, Mrs. Fletcher finally said. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away. Luke Carver comes to town 4, maybe 5 times a year. He's not cruel, but he's not soft. If you need reassurance or romance or... I need a place I can breathe, Clara interrupted. I need work that matters. I need to be useful instead of ornamental. She picked up the letter again, her thumb brushing over the careful handwriting. If this man wants honesty, I can give him that. If he needs someone who won't shatter from isolation, I've been alone in crowded rooms my entire life. Real isolation might be refreshing. Mrs. Fletcher studied her for a long moment, and Clara forced herself to remain still under that assessment. She knew what the older woman saw. A slender figure in a fashionable traveling dress that was already showing road wear, dark hair pinned in Boston style, hands that had never done ranch work, eyes that held either determination or delusion, depending on your perspective. He won't change, Mrs. Fletcher warned. The others tried. They tried to make him talk more, socialize more, be more. It never works. Luke Carver is exactly what that letter says. No more, no less. Good, Clara said simply. I'm tired of men who promise everything and deliver nothing but disappointment. At least with Mr. Carver, I know exactly what I'm getting. Do you? Mrs. Fletcher's laugh was short and sharp. Miss Hawthorne, you don't know anything. Not really. You're betting your entire future on 9 sentences from a man called Wolfe. Clara thought of Boston, of her father's study where she'd been told repeatedly that her intelligence was unbecoming, of the parlor where potential suitors had smiled politely while their eyes glazed over whenever she spoke about anything more substantial than weather or flowers, of her mother's funeral where she'd stood alone because she'd refused to pretend grief for a marriage that had been a slow murder. When do I leave? She asked. Mrs. Fletcher sighed, a sound carrying 3 decades of women making impossible choices and men creating impossible situations. She pulled out a fresh form, dipped her pen in ink with the resignation of someone who'd seen this story before and knew exactly how it would end. I'll send the telegram today. If Luke agrees, and God knows why he would after 3 failures, he'll come for you within the week. She began writing, her pen scratching across paper with bureaucratic efficiency. You'll need winter supplies, sturdy boots, warmer clothes than that Boston finery. The mercantile can help, but everything's expensive here. How much money do you have? Enough, Clara lied. Mrs. Fletcher's pen paused. She looked up, and in her eyes, Clara saw something worse than judgment, pity. Miss Hawthorne, I've done this long enough to know when a woman's running on desperation instead of funds. How much? $17? Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Mrs. Fletcher set down her pen. That won't even cover decent boots, let alone everything else you'll need. Winter at Cedar Creek Ranch isn't Boston winter. It's different. I'll manage. With what? Pride? But Mrs. Fletcher was already pulling out a ledger, flipping through pages with the efficiency of someone solving a problem she hadn't wanted to care about. All right, here's what we'll do. The mercantile owner, Sam Chen, owes me several favors. I'll arrange credit for essential supplies. And I mean essential, nothing fancy. You can work it off helping me with correspondence and record-keeping before Luke arrives. My arthritis makes writing difficult, and Lord knows I've got 3 months of filing that needs attention. Clara's throat tightened. I can't. You can, and you will, unless you'd prefer to meet your potential husband while wearing inappropriate footwear and freezing to death. Consider it an investment in my professional reputation. Mrs. Fletcher returned to her form. If you die of exposure in the first week, it reflects poorly on my matching services. Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. That's very practical of you. I'm a practical woman, Miss Hawthorne. And speaking practically, you should know one more thing about Luke Carver. Mrs. Fletcher finished writing, blotted the ink, and looked up with an expression caught between warning and something that might have been respect. The reason his other brides left wasn't because he was terrible. It was because he was honest. He told them exactly who he was, never pretended to be anything else, and they couldn't accept that. They wanted to fix him, save him, make him into some romantic notion of a Western hero. And you can't fix something that isn't broken. Luke Carver isn't a project or a romance novel hero. He's just a man who's more comfortable with silence than small talk, who's built a life alone and doesn't apologize for it. Mrs. Fletcher stood, moving to retrieve her coat. If you go to Cedar Creek expecting to change him, you'll end up like the others, running back to civilization within weeks. But if you can accept him as he is, she paused, something unreadable crossing her weathered face. Well, maybe the 5th time's the charm. 5th? You didn't think you were the first I've sent his way, did you? There was one other, years ago, before my time. She lasted 3 days. Mrs. Fletcher pulled on her coat. Come on, let's get you to Sam's Mercantile before I change my mind about this entire fool enterprise. The Greystone Mercantile occupied a long, narrow building that smelled of leather, tobacco, dried goods, and the accumulated dust of 1,000 transactions. Barrels lined one wall filled with flour, sugar, cornmeal, and beans. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, stacked with everything from cast-iron cookware to bottles of patent medicine making impossible promises. Sam Chen stood behind the counter, a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes that assessed Clara with the same calculating precision he probably applied to weighing out nails. Another one, Abigail, he said without preamble. For Carver? Unless you'd prefer she freeze to death and haunt your establishment. Mrs. Fletcher pulled off her gloves. She needs outfitting, properly. I'm vouching for the cost. Sam's eyebrows rose. You're vouching for Cedar Creek Ranch? I'm getting soft in my old age. Blame the winter. Mrs. Fletcher turned to Clara. Show him your feet. Clara blinked. I'm sorry? Your feet. Those ridiculous Boston shoes. Show him. Cheeks burning, Clara lifted her skirt hem slightly, revealing the kid leather boots that had seemed so practical in Massachusetts and now looked absurdly delicate against Wyoming's mud-churned floorboards. Sam whistled low. Those won't last a week. Sarah, he called toward the back room. Need your expertise. A woman emerged from behind a curtain, tall, with black hair braided down her back and features that suggested Chinese, Mexican, and something else blended together. She took one look at Clara's boots and laughed. Boston, she asked. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with eyes. Sarah Chen moved with the casual grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. She circled Clara once, her assessment professional and utterly without judgment. 5'4", small frame but good posture. Hands say you haven't done hard labor, but fingers say you're not afraid of work. Ink stains, needle pricks. Seamstress? Writer? Both, Clara admitted. I kept household accounts and did mending to earn my passage west. Smart, Sarah nodded approval. You'll need that. Come with me. For the next 2 hours, Clara was measured, assessed, and outfitted with an efficiency that left her head spinning. Sarah pulled items from shelves and storage with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, who understood exactly what kept a woman alive through a Wyoming winter at an isolated ranch. Boots first, Sarah declared, kneeling before Clara with several pairs. These are lined with rabbit fur. Not pretty, but they'll keep your toes from falling off. Try them. Clara slipped off her Boston boots, feeling immediately shorter, more vulnerable, and pushed her feet into the heavy leather. They were stiff, unfashioned, and utterly practical. Walk, Sarah commanded. Clara obeyed, pacing the mercantile's length. The boots were heavy, awkward, nothing like the delicate footwear she was accustomed to, but they fit well, and she could feel the difference immediately, the substantial sole, the ankle support, the warmth. These will do, she said. Those will save your life, Sarah corrected. She moved to a shelf, pulling down thick woolen stockings. You'll need at least 6 pairs. You'll wear 2 pairs at once when it's coldest, and you'll wash them in rotation. Keep them dry. Wet feet out there mean frostbite, and frostbite means losing toes, and losing toes means dying because you can't work or escape if something goes wrong. Clara swallowed hard. Sarah's bluntness was somehow more frightening than Mrs. Fletcher's warnings. This wasn't discouragement. This was survival. What else? She asked quietly. What followed was an education in frontier pragmatism. Sarah assembled Clara's new life piece by piece. Heavy wool skirts, 3 of them dyed practical browns and grays that wouldn't show every speck of dirt. You'll wear these until they're more patched than original fabric, Sarah explained. Then you'll cut them down and keep wearing them. Flannel petticoats, thick enough to stand on their own. Cotton chemises. A canvas work dress that could withstand hard labor. For mucking stalls and butchering, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Don't wear anything you care about for those jobs. A heavy wool coat with a hood lined in sheepskin. Leather gloves. A shawl thick enough to double as a blanket. A knit cap that pulled down over Clara's ears, making her look, she suspected, utterly ridiculous. You'll thank me when the temperature drops below 0, Sarah said, catching Clara's expression. Pride doesn't keep you warm. Then came the practical supplies. A sewing kit with extra needles and sturdy thread. A bar of lye soap, a hairbrush, a tin cup. A pocket knife that Sarah pressed into Clara's palm with unusual gravity. Keep this with you always, Sarah said. Not for protection. Carver has guns for that. But you'll use it every day for 1,000 tasks. Opening packages, cutting rope, cleaning under your nails, trimming candles. Don't lose it. Clara closed her fingers around the knife, feeling the weight of it, the simple utility. In Boston, ladies didn't carry knives. In Wyoming, apparently, survival demanded it. How much? She asked, though she already knew the answer would exceed her meager funds. Sam Chen consulted his ledger, his pen scratching as he tallied. The sound seemed to go on forever. Finally, $43.70. Clara's heart sank. More than twice what she possessed. I'll add it to Abigail's account, Sam interrupted. You can work it off with her. But Miss Hawthorne? He looked up, his expression serious. The women who make it out there aren't the ones who go looking for romance or rescue. They're the ones who understand that survival is the only story that matters. If you're going to Cedar Creek expecting anything else, you'd better speak up now. I'm not expecting anything, Clara said truthfully. Expectations have only ever disappointed me. Sarah laughed, a sharp, approving sound. You might actually make it, Boston. You've got that look. What look? The one that says you'd rather die standing than live kneeling. Sarah began wrapping the purchases in brown paper, her movements efficient. Carver might appreciate that, or he might hate it. Men like him are hard to predict. Have you met him? Once, maybe twice. He comes to town rarely, speaks rarely, leaves quickly. Sarah tied the first package with string. But I'll tell you what I noticed. He's lonely, but he doesn't know it. Or maybe he knows it and decided loneliness is easier than the alternative. Either way, he's built a fortress around himself that most women can't breach. I'm not trying to breach anything, Clara said. I just need a place to be useful. Sam and Sarah exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them. Then Sam nodded slowly. That might be exactly what he needs, he said. Someone who wants to work alongside him instead of fixing him. He pushed the ledger aside. The telegram went out this morning. If Carver agrees, he'll come within a week. If he doesn't... Sam shrugged. Well, at least you'll be warm while you figure out your next move, said. 5 days later, Clara stood on Mrs. Fletcher's office porch, watching the horizon where the road from Cedar Creek Ranch emerged between two low hills. Snow had fallen overnight, dusting gray stone and white that would be brown with mud by noon. Her new boots kept her feet warm, her new coat kept the wind at bay, and her heart hammered with something she refused to call fear. He'll either come or he won't, Mrs. Fletcher said from inside, where she sat by the Franklin stove working through correspondence Clara had organized. Luke Carver isn't one for wasted time or sentiment. If he rejected your match, he'd have telegraphed back immediately. Unless he's too isolated to receive the telegram, Clara pointed out. The telegraph office sends a writer. Luke gets his messages, even if it takes an extra day. Mrs. Fletcher appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one to Clara. You've been standing there for an hour. Come inside before you freeze yourself into a statue. I need to see him coming. Why? Planning to run? The question was asked lightly, but Clara heard the genuine curiosity beneath it. She took the coffee gratefully, warming her gloved hands around the tin cup. I want time to prepare, she said honestly, to make sure my expression doesn't reveal anything I don't want him to see. And what don't you want him to see? Clara considered the question, watching steam rise from her coffee. Desperation, hope, fear. Any of the things that would give him power over me. Mrs. Fletcher smiled, not unkindly. Miss Hawthorne, if you think you can hide those things from Luke Carver, you're fooling yourself. He might be more comfortable with wolves than people, but that doesn't make him stupid. He'll see exactly what you're feeling, whether you want him to or not. Then I'll have to feel nothing. That's one approach. Another would be honesty, the same thing you claim to appreciate in his letter. Before Clara could respond, Mrs. Fletcher straightened, her gaze sharpening on something beyond Clara's shoulder. Speaking of which, Clara turned. A wagon was cresting the far hill, pulled by 2 sturdy horses whose breath plumed white in the cold air. Even from this distance she could see the driver, a tall figure in dark clothes, his posture suggesting someone completely comfortable with isolation and travel. That's him, Mrs. Fletcher said unnecessarily. Clara's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She had perhaps 3 minutes before Luke Carver arrived. 3 minutes to decide what kind of woman she'd be when she met the man who might become her husband. The wagon drew closer. Clara could make out more details now. The horses were well kept, the wagon sturdy but weathered. And the man? Luke Carver sat with the easy confidence of someone who'd made this journey countless times. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered beneath a sheepskin coat. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see a dark beard trimmed close. His hands on the reins were large, scarred, the hands of someone who worked with them every day. He didn't hurry, didn't slow, just maintained a steady pace until he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Mrs. Fletcher's office with the same efficient economy that characterized his letter. For a moment, nobody moved. Luke Carver sat on his wagon, looking at Clara. Clara stood on the porch, looking back. Mrs. Fletcher wisely remained silent. Clara saw sun-weathered skin and lines around his eyes, not from age, but from squinting across vast distances. She saw a strong jaw beneath the beard and eyes that were some indeterminate color between brown and green, the color of pine forests after rain. She saw a man who looked exactly like his letter had sounded, blunt, honest, stripped of pretense, and she saw loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. "You're smaller than I expected," Luke Carver said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, with none of the polish or performance Clara was accustomed to from men. "You're quieter," Clara replied, refusing to let her voice shake. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, or approval. He swung down from the wagon with the controlled grace of someone whose body was accustomed to hard physical work. Up close, he was even taller than she'd realized, forcing her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Mrs. Fletcher says you're stubborn," he said. "Mr. Henderson found me inconvenient. Henderson's a fool who wants a woman who'll nod and smile while he makes the same mistakes his father made." Luke's gaze traveled over her, assessing without being intrusive. "You correct his irrigation plans? They were inefficient. Were you right?" "Yes." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "The other women who came to Cedar Creek wanted to talk, constantly, about nothing, about everything, about their feelings and my feelings, and whether we were connecting properly." He paused. "Can you handle silence?" "I prefer it to empty noise." Now he did smile, just slightly. "Good." He turned to Mrs. Fletcher. "She'll need supplies. Winter stores. I've got credit at Chen's." "Already handled," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Sam Chen outfitted her earlier this week. She's been working off the cost helping me." Luke's eyebrows rose slightly, and he looked at Clara with what might have been respect. "You work fast." "I don't believe in wasting time." "Neither do I." He moved to the wagon, retrieving a battered trunk. "This everything you own?" Clara thought of her cabin trunk still at the boarding house, holding the remainder of her Boston life. "I have another trunk, clothes, books, personal items." "Books are fine. Anything else you need from town before we leave?" The question was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of ceremony, that Clara almost laughed. No courtship, no flowery speeches or romantic gestures, just, "Do you need anything before we leave?" It was, she realized, exactly what she'd hoped for. "No," she said. "I'm ready." Luke nodded once. "Good. It's a 6-hour drive to the ranch. We'll need to leave soon to make it before dark." He looked at Mrs. Fletcher. "Send the wedding papers to Judge Morrison. We'll handle the formalities when I come to town in March." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened. "You're taking her without—" "She came here for a marriage arrangement. I'm agreeing to the arrangement. The paperwork is just paperwork." Luke's gaze returned to Clara, steady and uncompromising. "Unless you've changed your mind." Clara thought about Boston, about her father's house and her mother's grave and the suffocating parlors where women became ghosts. She thought about Mr. Henderson's telegram calling her too stubborn, as if having opinions was a character flaw requiring correction. She thought about Luke Carver's letter with its brutal honesty and complete lack of pretense. "I haven't changed my mind," she said clearly. "Then get your trunk. We're losing daylight." 20 minutes later, Clara sat on the wagon bench beside Luke Carver, her cabin trunk secured in the wagon bed alongside supplies he'd purchased: flour, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, lamp oil. Greystone fell behind them as the horses pulled the wagon onto the rutted road leading into Wyoming's vast emptiness. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Luke guided the horses with minimal effort, his attention on the road and the country unfolding around them. Clara watched the landscape transform, the scattered buildings of town giving way to rolling prairie, then to rougher country where rock formations jutted like broken teeth and pine forests climbed distant mountains. It was beautiful, terrible and beautiful and utterly unforgiving. You're not afraid, Luke said suddenly. Clara turned to look at him. He was still watching the road, but something in his posture suggested genuine curiosity. Of what? She asked. Any of it. The isolation. Me. The 6-hour journey with a stranger. He glanced at her briefly. The others were afraid from the start. Tried to hide it, but I could see. You're not hiding anything. Would it matter if I was afraid? No. But I'd know you were lying. He returned his attention to the horses. I don't tolerate lying. Say what you mean, or say nothing. Fair enough. Clara pulled her coat tighter as the wind picked up. Then I'll tell you the truth. I'm terrified. Not of you, but of failing. Again. I'm terrified that I'll prove everyone right. That I'm too stubborn, or too opinionated, or too something to make this work. But being terrified has never stopped me before, and it won't stop me now. Luke was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too much. Then, good, he said simply. Because Cedar Creek Ranch will test you. The isolation tests everyone. The silence, the winters, the work. If you're already looking for reasons to fail, you will. But if you're determined to make it work, he shrugged. Maybe you will. That's not very encouraging. I'm not very encouraging. I told you, I'm not good with words or people. I can teach you ranch work. I can keep you safe and fed and warm. But I can't give you comfort or conversation or whatever it is women usually need from husbands. If that's what you're expecting, I'm not expecting anything, Clara interrupted. You said so yourself in your letter. Don't expect to change me, and you won't expect to change me. I'm holding you to that. Another of those almost smiles. All right then, we understand each other. They traveled on as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning snow until the ground showed through in patches of brown and gray. The road deteriorated from rough to barely existent, marked more by wagon ruts and scattered stones than any deliberate construction. Around midday, Luke pulled the wagon to a stop beside a frozen creek. Rest the horses, he said, climbing down. There's dried meat and hardtack in the supply box if you're hungry. Clara clambered down less gracefully, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. Luke was already tending to the horses, checking their hooves and offering them water from a bucket he'd filled by breaking the ice on the creek's surface. She watched him work. Economical movements, quiet efficiency, the kind of competence that came from years of practice. He murmured something to one of the horses, too low for Clara to hear, and the animal nickered softly in response. You're gentler with them than you are with people, Clara observed. Luke straightened, giving her a level look. Horses don't expect things I can't give. What do people expect that you can't give? He was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the horse's neck. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Comfort. Companionship. The ability to talk about nothing just to fill silence. Romance. He practically spat the last word. The first wife who came to Cedar Creek brought books about romance, stories where men swept women off their feet with pretty words and grand gestures. She kept reading passages aloud, asking if I thought they were beautiful. What did you say? That they were words, just words, meaningless if they weren't backed by action. Luke returned to checking the horse's harness. She left 3 days later, said I had no soul. Clara retrieved the dried meat and hardtack, bringing portions to Luke before settling on a flat rock to eat. The food was tough and bland, but it was fuel, and she was learning to think of food that way, not as pleasure, but as necessity. Maybe you didn't, she said thoughtfully. Have no soul, I mean. Maybe you just had a different kind, one that shows itself in actions instead of poetry. Luke looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. A crack in that carefully maintained wall. Most people don't see it that way, he said quietly. Most people are fools. This time he laughed, a rusty sound, as if it had been years since he'd used it. You might be right about that. He finished with the horses and came to sit on a boulder near her rock, maintaining a careful distance but no longer completely isolating himself. Why'd you come west? Real reason, not the one you tell Mrs. Fletcher. Clara chewed her hardtack slowly, considering how honest to be. Then she remembered his rule. Say what you mean, or say nothing. My mother spent her entire life becoming smaller, she said. My father wanted a wife who reflected his status, who never contradicted him, who existed to make him comfortable. She did exactly that, folded herself into smaller and smaller pieces until there was nothing left. She died when I was 23, and at her funeral, I realized nobody really knew who she'd been. They knew what she'd done, how perfectly she'd hosted dinners, how gracefully she'd managed the household, but who she was. That woman had disappeared years before her body finally gave up. Luke said nothing, just watched her with those forest-colored eyes, and Clara found it easier to continue in his silence than she would have in someone else's sympathy. My father expected me to follow her path, to marry some appropriate Boston man and spend my life being appropriate and quiet and decorative, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to be what he wanted, I felt like I was dying, so I started refusing. Started speaking up in conversations where women were supposed to smile and nod. Started correcting mistakes and pointing out flaws, and generally being everything a proper Boston lady shouldn't be. And my father called me stubborn, difficult, unmarriageable. He died angry at me, and honestly, Clara met Luke's gaze steadily. I don't regret it. I'd rather be stubborn and alive than appropriate and dead. That why Henderson sent you back? He wanted a woman who'd let him make mistakes without pointing them out. I'm not capable of watching someone do things wrong when I know how to do them right. Luke stood, brushing hardtack crumbs from his pants. Cedar Creek has plenty that needs doing right. You'll have more work than you can handle. He moved to the horses, beginning to hitch them back to the wagon. But I need to know, are you looking for a marriage, or are you looking for an escape? The question struck harder than Clara expected. She stood slowly, her mind working through the layers of truth. Can it be both? She asked finally. Depends. Luke tightened a strap, his movements sure. If you're escaping one prison just to build another, you'll end up resenting Cedar Creek the way you resented Boston. But if you're escaping toward something, he paused, seeming to struggle for words. If you're escaping toward the person you actually are, instead of the person others wanted you to be, then maybe it can work. Clara climbed back onto the wagon bench, settling herself against the cold wood. And what about you? Are you looking for a wife, or are you looking for something else? Luke swung up beside her, taking the reins. For a long moment, he didn't answer, just urged the horses forward. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels finding the rutted road. Finally, I'm looking for someone who won't leave when they discover who I actually am. The honesty of it, the raw, unguarded honesty, made Clara's throat tight. Then I suppose we're both looking for the same thing. Suppose we are. They traveled on into the afternoon, and gradually, tentatively, conversation sprouted between them. Not constant or comfortable, but real. Luke talked about the ranch, 200 acres of high country, cattle, and horses. A cabin he'd built himself 5 years ago when he'd finally saved enough to buy the land. He talked about the work, dawn rising to tend stock, mending fences, hauling water, preparing for winters that could trap you for weeks. Clara listened and asked questions, not to make conversation, but because she genuinely wanted to know. How many cattle? What breed? How did you keep them fed through winter? What happened if you got sick with no one around to help? You think about practical things, Luke observed as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Is that bad? No, it's good. The others asked about social calls and church services and whether I'd take them to dances in town. He shook his head. Out here, surviving matters more than socializing. I'd rather survive than dance. We're going to get along fine then. The landscape grew rougher as they climbed into higher country. Pine forests closed in on either side, their branches heavy with snow that the sun hadn't reached. The road became less a road and more a suggestion carved through wilderness. Several times Luke had to guide the horses carefully around deadfall or frozen washouts. We're close, he said as the sun touched the mountains. Another mile. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. Another mile. And then what? She'd be at Cedar Creek Ranch with a man she'd known for less than a day, bound by an agreement that was almost but not quite marriage, in isolation so complete that her nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. What do the other ranch wives do? She asked, more to fill silence than from genuine curiosity. There are no other ranch wives. Not close by. Luke kept his eyes on the darkening road. The nearest place is the Henderson spread, and you know how that turned out. After that, it's 12 miles to the Zimmerman place. They're an older couple who mostly keep to themselves. Then nothing until you get back toward town. So I really will be alone. You'll be with me. Clara almost laughed at the distinction. Is that the same thing? Luke's hands tightened on the reins. Might be. I'm not good company, Clara. I won't fill your days with conversation. I won't always remember to ask how you're feeling or whether you need anything. I'll work from dawn to dusk and sometimes longer, and there will be days, maybe weeks, where we barely speak except about practical matters. But I'll never lie to you. I'll never pretend to be something I'm not. I'll teach you everything I know about surviving out here, and I'll never make you smaller to make myself bigger. He glanced at her briefly. If that's enough, we'll be fine. If it's not, it's enough, Clara said firmly. I've had enough pretty words and empty promises to last a lifetime. I'd rather have honest silence. Good, because there. He pointed ahead where the trees opened into a small valley. In the fading light, Clara could just make out shapes. A cabin, outbuildings, fenced corrals. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. Luke must have banked the fire before leaving, ensuring warmth upon his return. Cedar Creek Ranch, her new home. As they descended into the valley, details emerged. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, built from thick logs with a shake roof. A barn stood behind it, solid and weatherproof. Corrals stretched beyond that, currently empty. Everything was neat, maintained, the work of someone who took pride in keeping things functional. Luke pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. For a moment, neither moved. Clara stared at the structure that would define her life and felt the weight of every choice that had brought her here settle onto her shoulders. Last chance, Luke said quietly. If you want to change your mind, I'll take you back to town tomorrow. No judgment, no questions. Clara climbed down from the wagon, her new boots finding purchase in the packed snow. She looked at the cabin, at the valley surrounding it, at the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. She thought of Boston, of her mother's grave and her father's disappointment, of Mr. Henderson's telegram and every person who'd ever called her too much or too stubborn or too difficult. She thought of Luke Carver's letter, with its brutal honesty and lack of pretense. I'm not changing my mind, she said. Luke nodded once, then swung down from the wagon. He grabbed her trunk and started toward the cabin. Then welcome to Cedar Creek, Clara. Hope you meant what you said about honest silence. Clara followed him through the door, into the warm darkness, into her new life. And for the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe. The cabin's interior smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something indefinably masculine, leather and work and solitude. Clara stood just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the lamplight Luke had just kindled. The space was larger than it appeared from outside. One main room with a sleeping loft visible above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its banked coals already beginning to flare back to life as Luke added fresh wood. A sturdy table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined another wall, holding supplies and a surprising number of books. A cast-iron stove stood in the corner, practical and well-maintained. Everything was clean, sparse, but clean. The floor had been swept recently, the dishes stacked neatly on a shelf beside the dry sink. This wasn't the chaos of a man who'd given up on civilization. It was the careful order of someone who understood that survival depended on organization. Loft's yours, Luke said, carrying her trunk toward a ladder built into the wall. I'll sleep down here by the fire. More practical for tending it through the night. Clara watched him climb the ladder with her trunk balanced on one shoulder, his movements easy despite the burden. The loft was a mystery above. She couldn't see what waited up there, but she trusted it would be as practical and clean as everything else. There's fresh water in the bucket, Luke continued, descending the ladder. Privy's out back, 30 feet from the cabin. Take a lantern after dark. We've got wolves, and they're curious about new scents. They won't hurt you if you're careful, but don't surprise them. Wolves. Clara added that to the growing list of things that would have terrified her Boston self and somehow didn't frighten her now. Perhaps because Luke spoke of them matter-of-factly, as simply another fact of life at Cedar Creek, like the weather or the work schedule. What else should I know? She asked. Luke moved to the stove, checking the fire there as well. Cattle are in the near pasture. You'll see them tomorrow. Horses in the barn. We've got 4. The 2 that pulled the wagon, plus a mare and a gelding I use for riding fence lines. You ride? I took lessons in Boston, park riding. Not the same as ranch riding, but it's a start. He straightened, finally looking at her directly. In the lamplight, his face was all planes and shadows, the lines around his eyes deeper than she'd noticed outside. You must be hungry. Real food, not trail rations. I can cook, Clara offered. Not tonight. You've traveled all day. Luke moved to the shelves, pulling down supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd cooked alone for years. Sit, I'll make something quick. Clara wanted to argue. She'd come here to be useful, not to be waited on. But something in Luke's posture suggested this wasn't negotiable. This was his space, his routine, and he needed to maintain some control over it. So she sat at the table, removing her coat and gloves, and watched him work. He moved through the cabin like water finding its course, every motion practiced and economical. Bread from a covered tin, butter from a crock kept cool near the door, dried meat sliced thin. A pot of beans that must have been simmering before he left for town, kept warm at the stove's edge. You cooked before you left, Clara observed. How did you know I'd agree to come? Didn't, but I'd need to eat either way. Luke ladled beans into 2 bowls, added bread and meat to 2 plates. If you'd refused, I'd have had leftovers for the week. He set the food on the table and took the chair opposite hers. For a moment, they just sat there, looking at the simple meal between them. Clara realized this was the first time she'd eaten at a table with a man who wasn't performing. Her father had always used mealtimes for lectures. Mr. Henderson had filled every silence with opinions about his own brilliance, but Luke just picked up his spoon and began eating, content to let the quiet settle around them like snow. Clara followed his example. The beans were surprisingly good, seasoned with salt pork and something else, maybe wild onions. The bread was dense and filling, clearly homemade. The meal wasn't fancy, but it was honest and substantial, and she found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. You're a good cook, she said after several minutes. Luke shrugged. It's practical. Can't work if you don't eat properly. He paused, seemed to consider something, then continued. The others, the women who came before, they wanted to take over the cooking immediately, said a man shouldn't have to cook for himself when he had a wife, but they didn't know how to cook for ranch work. They made fancy things, delicate things, food that might impress at a dinner party, but didn't stick to your ribs through 12 hours of hard labor. Did you tell them? Tried. They took it as criticism. He mopped up bean juice with his bread. Eventually stopped trying to explain and just went back to cooking for myself. They'd eat what I made or they wouldn't. Didn't matter to me. Clara set down her spoon. Luke, I need to understand something. You said you need a wife, but it sounds like you've gotten along fine alone. Why keep trying? He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on his bowl. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees surrounding the cabin. Clara waited, learning already that Luke's silences weren't empty. They were full of thoughts he was carefully sorting before speaking. Loneliness is different than solitude, he finally said. I chose solitude. Chose this life away from towns and crowds and constant noise. But loneliness... He looked up, and Clara saw something raw in his expression. Loneliness creeps in whether you choose it or not. It's waking up knowing you'll speak to no one all day. It's having a thought and realizing there's no one to share it with. It's wondering if you died tomorrow. How long before anyone noticed? The honesty of it struck Clara like a physical blow. This was what Boston's poets tried to capture with their flowery language and never quite managed, the simple, devastating truth of human need. I don't expect romance, Luke continued, or even friendship, really, but I hoped, having another person here might make the silence less heavy, might give the work more meaning than just surviving until the next season. He pushed his empty bowl away. But the women who came wanted me to be different, wanted me to fill their loneliness while ignoring mine. So they left, and I'm still here, and the silence is still heavy. Clara reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that he could feel her presence. I'm not here to fix you or change you. I'm here because I understand that kind of loneliness. The kind where you're surrounded by people but still completely alone because none of them see who you actually are. Luke's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Not romance, but recognition. Two people who'd been fundamentally misunderstood, finding someone who might finally understand. "Then maybe this will work," he said quietly. "Maybe it will." They finished their meal in a silence that felt less empty than it had before. Luke cleared the dishes, refusing Clara's offer to help with the same quiet insistence he'd shown earlier. She watched him work, noting how he washed each dish thoroughly and stacked them precisely on their shelf. This wasn't a man who did things carelessly. "I'll show you around properly tomorrow," Luke said, banking the fire in the stove. "Tonight you should rest. Travel takes it out of you, even if you don't feel it yet." Clara stood, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The tension of waiting for Luke to arrive, the 6-hour wagon journey, the constant vigilance of meeting someone new, all of it crashed over her at once. She swayed slightly, catching herself on the table. Luke was beside her immediately, his hand steadying her elbow. "When's the last time you slept properly?" "The night before Mr. Henderson sent me back." Clara managed a tired smile. "I've been too anxious to sleep well since then." "That was 5 days ago." His voice carried a note of disapproval. "You can't work on no sleep." "I'll sleep tonight." "You will." He guided her toward the ladder, his hand still supporting her elbow. "There's extra blankets in the loft if you need them. Nights get cold up there until the cabin warms through." Clara climbed the ladder, each rung requiring more effort than the last. The loft was small but adequate, with a real bed. Not fancy, but infinitely better than she'd expected. Her trunk sat at its foot. A small window looked out over the valley, currently showing nothing but darkness and stars. Someone had already laid a quilt over the mattress, thick and worn soft with use. "That was my mother's," Luke called up from below. "Only fancy thing in the cabin. She pieced it the year I was born." Clara ran her fingers over the quilt, feeling the careful stitches. The love worked into every seam. This wasn't just fabric. It was history, family, trust. Luke had given her something precious, without ceremony or explanation, and the gesture meant more than any flowery speech could have. "Thank you," she called down. "Welcome." A pause, then, "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Luke." She changed into her nightdress by the light filtering up from below, too tired to care about modesty. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with what felt like straw and dried grass. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and closed her eyes, expecting to fall asleep immediately. Instead, awareness flooded through her. She was in Wyoming territory, in a cabin 40 miles from town, with a man she'd met that morning, about to begin a life so foreign to everything she'd known that it might as well be another country. Below, she could hear Luke moving around, the soft scrape of a chair, the rustle of pages. He was reading, she realized. One of those books from the shelf. The normality of it, the gentle domesticity, somehow made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. This was her life now. This cabin, this man, this vast silence. And for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, that realization didn't terrify her. It steadied her, centered her, made her feel like she'd finally found solid ground after years of standing on shifting sand. Clara pulled the quilt tighter and let herself fall into sleep. Her last conscious thought a simple one. "I'm home." She woke to the smell of coffee and the pale gray light of dawn. For a disoriented moment, Clara couldn't remember where she was. The ceiling was wrong, the sounds were wrong, the quality of light was wrong. Then memory flooded back. Cedar Creek Ranch, Luke Carver, her new life. She dressed quickly in the cold air, pulling on one of her new wool skirts and a flannel shirt. Her fingers fumbled with the unfamiliar buttons. These clothes were so different from Boston's fashions, built for function rather than form. But they were warm, and warmth mattered more than appearance out here. Descending the ladder, she found Luke already dressed and moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency. He'd rebuilt the fires, put coffee on to boil, and was pulling on his heavy coat. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Coffee's ready, bread and butter on the table. I need to see to the stock. It'll take about an hour. After that, I'll show you around." "I can help with the stock." Luke paused, his hand on the door latch. "You know how?" "No, but I can learn. Something shifted in his expression, that recognition again, that sense of finding someone who understood that competence mattered more than pretense. All right, put on your coat and boots. It's cold, and the work is messy. 10 minutes later, Clara followed Luke through the pre-dawn darkness toward the barn, her breath pluming white in the frigid air. The stars were just beginning to fade, the eastern sky lightening to pale silver. Around them, the valley was utterly silent except for the crunch of their boots in the snow and the distant call of what might have been a coyote. The barn was warmer than outside, but still cold enough that Clara could see her breath. Luke lit 2 lanterns, hanging them from hooks that cast wavering light over 4 stalls, each holding a horse that nickered softly at their approach. "This is Scout," Luke said, stroking the nose of a tall bay gelding. "He's steady, good for long rides over rough country. Next to him is Thunder. The name's a joke. He's the quietest horse I've ever owned. Those are the wagon horses from yesterday. The mare is Rosie. The gelding is Duke." Clara moved closer, letting Rosie sniff her hand. The mare's breath was warm against her palm, her dark eyes curious but gentle. "They need hay and water twice daily," Luke continued, already moving to pitch hay from a stack in the corner. "More if the weather's harsh. Watch their hooves for ice buildup. It'll make them lame if you're not careful. And check under their blankets for rub marks. Cold weather means they're blanketed most of the time, but the blankets can chafe if they don't fit properly." He worked as he talked, demonstrating each task with practiced ease. Clara watched carefully, committing every detail to memory: how much hay to give, how to break the ice in the water trough, how to check a hoof without startling the horse. Luke's teaching style matched his personality: concise, practical, assuming she could understand without excessive explanation. "Your turn," he said, handing her the pitchfork. Clara took it, testing the weight. It was heavier than she'd expected, the handle rough against her gloved palms. She moved to the haystack and tried to replicate Luke's efficient motion: drive the fork in, lift, carry to the stall, deposit into the feeder. The first forkful was manageable. The second made her arms tremble. By the third, she understood why Luke's shoulders were so broad. This was brutal work, repeated day after day, season after season. "Smaller loads," Luke advised, not unkindly. "You'll build strength, but start with what you can manage. Better to take 10 trips than to hurt yourself trying to match what I can lift." Clara adjusted, taking smaller amounts. It took her 3 times as long to finish feeding the horses, but she did finish, her arms burning with effort and her breath coming hard. Luke said nothing, just watched her work and nodded approval when she was done. "Cattle next," he said. The cattle were in a pasture visible from the cabin, about 20 head clustered near a feeding station Luke had set up. They were stocky animals, shaggier than Clara had expected, their breath creating a collective cloud in the cold air. "Herefords," Luke explained, climbing over the fence with a bag of feed. "Hardy breed, good for this climate. They can handle cold that would kill fancier cattle, and they're smart enough to dig through snow for grass when they need to." Clara watched as he distributed the feed, the cattle pressing close with rumbling complaints about breakfast being late. They were larger up close than they'd seemed from a distance, their eyes liquid and surprisingly intelligent. "Can I touch one?" she asked. "That old girl on the end. She's gentle. Just move slow and keep your voice quiet." Clara approached carefully, extending her hand the way she had with the horses. The cow regarded her with mild interest, then allowed Clara to stroke her broad forehead. The hair was coarse, warm, despite the cold, and the animal's size was both intimidating and oddly comforting. "She likes you," Luke observed. "Animals know when someone's afraid or aggressive. You're neither." "Should I be?" "Afraid? No. Respectful? Always. Cattle are usually docile, but they're big and they can hurt you if you're careless." He finished distributing feed and climbed back over the fence. "Come on, chickens are next, then I'll make breakfast." The chicken coop was a small structure behind the barn, surprisingly well built with nest boxes and perches. Inside, a dozen hens clucked irritably at the intrusion, clearly displeased that breakfast was being delayed by conversation. "Gather the eggs," Luke said, handing Clara a basket. "Watch out for Gertrude, the red hen in the back. She's territorial about her nest, and she will peck you." Clara moved carefully among the hens, sliding her hands beneath warm, feathered bodies to retrieve eggs. Most of the hens tolerated this indignity with resigned clucks, but Gertrude, true to Luke's warning, made her displeasure known with a sharp peck to Clara's wrist. "Damn," Clara muttered, pulling back her hand. "Told you," Luke said, though she could hear amusement in his voice. "Gertrude rules the coop, even I give her space." By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun had fully risen, painting the valley in shades of gold and silver. Clara's arms ached, her wrist throbbed where Gertrude had pecked her, and she was colder than she'd ever been in her life. But she also felt more alive than she had in years. "You did well," Luke said as they stamped snow from their boots on the porch. "Most people struggle more their first time." "I'm stronger than I look." "I'm starting to see that." Inside, Luke cooked breakfast while Clara warmed her hands by the fire. He made it look effortless. Bacon in a cast-iron skillet, eggs cracked with one hand, bread toasted on the stovetop. The domestic competence should have looked strange on such a physically imposing man, but instead it seemed natural, just another skill required for survival. They ate together at the table, the morning light streaming through the cabin's small windows. Clara's body was already starting to stiffen from the unfamiliar work, and she knew tomorrow would be worse. But there was satisfaction in the ache, proof that she'd done something real and necessary. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, soaking up bacon grease with her bread. "How did you end up here?" Luke was quiet for a moment, his coffee cup cradled in both hands. "Grew up in Missouri. My father worked for other men's ranches his whole life. Never had anything of his own. Died young from it, just worn out. I decided I'd rather own 5 acres than work 50 for someone else." He stared into his coffee. "Saved for 15 years, worked every job I could find, spent almost nothing. Came to Wyoming Territory in '70 because land was cheap and the cattle industry was growing. Built this cabin myself, bought my first cattle with the last of my savings." "And the wives? How did that start?" "First year was fine. I was too busy to be lonely, but the second winter," he trailed off, his jaw working. "The second winter I realized I was talking to the horses because I needed to hear a voice, even if it was my own. Realized I'd gone 2 months without seeing another person. That's when I understood solitude and loneliness weren't the same thing." "So you advertised for a wife?" Mrs. Fletcher suggested it. She'd had success matching men and women who wanted practical arrangements rather than romance. Luke set down his cup. "The first woman lasted 2 months, like I said. She wanted me to be someone I wasn't, more talkative, more social, more interested in her feelings than the cattle. The second one came with ideas about civilizing me. Wanted me to shave the beard, wear better clothes, attend church in town every Sunday. And the third lasted 6 weeks. Left in the middle of the night during a snowstorm. Said the silence was suffocating her, that living with me was like living with a ghost." His voice was flat, carefully emptied of emotion, but Clara could hear the hurt beneath it. She might have been right about that. Clara reached across the table, this time deliberately covering his hand with hers. His skin was rough, scarred, warm. "She was wrong. You're not a ghost. You're just someone who's more comfortable with honest silence than empty words." Luke's fingers curled slightly around hers, a gesture so tentative it made her chest ache. "How long do you think you'll last?" The question should have offended her. Instead, Clara understood it for what it was. Not a challenge, but a genuine question from someone who'd been left too many times to believe in permanence. "I'll last as long as you'll have me," she said simply. "I meant what I said yesterday. I'm not looking for romance or rescue. I'm looking for a place I can be useful and honest and fully myself. If Cedar Creek Ranch can be that place, then I'm not going anywhere. And if it can't, then we'll figure that out together." Clara squeezed his hand before pulling back. "But I'm not running at the first sign of difficulty, Luke. I crossed half a continent to escape people who wanted me to be smaller. I'm not about to give up the first place that might let me be bigger." Something in Luke's expression eased, the tension he'd been carrying since yesterday softening slightly. "All right then. Let's see if we can make this work." He stood collecting their empty plates. "I need to ride the fence line today, checking for damage from the last storm. You can come with me or stay here. Your choice." Clara didn't hesitate. "I'll come." An hour later, Clara sat astride Rosie, the mare moving with a gentle gait that made park riding seem laughably tame. Luke rode Thunder beside her, his posture relaxed despite the rough terrain. They'd been riding for 30 minutes, following the fence line that marked Cedar Creek Ranch's northern boundary. "See that post?" Luke pointed to a fence post leaning at an odd angle. "Storm damage. Wind probably caught it wrong. We'll need to reset it before spring or the whole section will come down." They dismounted and Luke retrieved tools from his saddlebag: hammer, nails, wire cutters. Clara watched as he examined the damage, his hands moving over the wood with professional assessment. "Can you hold this steady while I hammer?" he asked. Clara grasped the post, bracing it upright while Luke drove stakes to reinforce the base. The impact of each hammer blow jarred through her arms, but she held firm, understanding that her strength mattered here. She wasn't decorative. She was necessary. "Good," Luke said when he finished. "You've got steady hands." They continued along the fence line, stopping twice more to make repairs. Each time Luke showed Clara what to look for: the telltale lean of a failing post, the rust on wire that indicated weakness, the patterns in snow that suggested animal interference. "You're teaching me," Clara observed as they remounted. "Of course I am. Can't have you here if you don't know how to maintain the place." Luke urged Thunder forward. "What if I get hurt or sick? You'd need to handle things yourself until I recovered." The practicality of it struck Clara forcefully. This wasn't a husband hoarding knowledge to maintain power. This was a partner ensuring they both had the skills to survive. Luke was teaching her because he trusted her to be capable, because he understood that her competence made both of them safer. "My father never taught me anything practical," Clara said, guiding Rosie around a fallen branch. "He said ladies didn't need to know about business or money or how things actually worked, that men would handle those things for us." "How'd that work out for your mother?" "She died not knowing how much money they had or where it was kept. My father had to explain finances to her on her deathbed so she'd understand what I was inheriting." Clara felt the old anger rise, sharp and bitter. She was terrified, not of dying, but of leaving me alone without knowledge of how to manage. "You inherited a small amount, enough to pay my passage west and have a little left over." Clara patted the pocket where she kept her remaining money. "My father's brothers got the house and business. I got enough to be independent, but not enough to be comfortable." Luke was quiet for several minutes, just the sound of hooves and wind and the distant call of a hawk. Then, "Independence matters more than comfort. Comfort can trap you. Independence sets you free." "Is that why you're here? Freedom?" "Partly. Also because I'm not good at taking orders from men stupider than me." A slight smile. "Turns out most bosses don't appreciate being corrected." Clara laughed, a real, genuine laugh that startled a nearby rabbit into flight. "We have that in common, then." They reached the eastern boundary of the property, where Cedar Creek itself ran through a narrow canyon, the water still flowing despite the cold. Luke dismounted and led Thunder to the creek's edge, letting him drink. Clara followed suit with Rosie, standing beside Luke on the rocky bank. "This is where the ranch gets its name," Luke said, gesturing to the cedar trees clustered along the canyon walls. "When I first saw this place, I knew I had to have it. Water, shelter, good grazing, everything I needed. It's beautiful. It's practical. Beauty's a bonus." But his eyes lingered on the canyon, and Clara could see the affection there. This wasn't just land to Luke. It was home in a way Boston had never been home to her. "Tell me something," Luke said suddenly. "Why'd you really leave Boston? Not the version you told Mrs. Fletcher. The real reason." Clara considered lying or deflecting. Then she remembered his rule: say what you mean or say nothing. And she was tired of lying, even small, polite lies that smoothed social interactions. "I was suffocating," she said simply. "Every day felt like drowning slowly. I'd wake up and know exactly how the day would go. The same conversations, the same expectations, the same crushing disappointment that I wasn't enough or was too much, depending on who was judging. I watched other women my age settle into marriages that looked like prison sentences, and I'd rather have died than joined them." "So you ran." "I escaped. There's a difference." "Is there?" Luke turned to look at her directly. "Running is reactive. You're fleeing something. Escaping is active. You're moving towards something better. Which was it?" Clara thought about that day in her father's brownstone 3 weeks after his funeral. The lawyer had read the will. Her uncles had already started planning to sell everything. She'd stood in her mother's bedroom, holding that morning brooch, and realized she had a choice: stay and become a ghost like her mother, or leave and risk becoming nothing at all. Both, she admitted. I was running from one thing and escaping toward another. I didn't know what the another was, but I knew it had to exist somewhere. And now you're at Cedar Creek Ranch with a man you've known for one day, 40 miles from the nearest town. Luke's voice was carefully neutral. Does that feel like escape or just a different kind of prison? Clara looked around at the canyon, the creek, the vast sky stretching endlessly overhead. She listened to the silence, the kind that came from space rather than suppression. She felt the cold wind on her face, sharp and honest, and utterly indifferent to her comfort. It feels like breathing, she said quietly. For the first time in my life, it feels like I can breathe. Luke held her gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them. Not romance, but understanding. Recognition. The kind of connection that came from two people who'd both learned that loneliness in a crowd was worse than solitude in wilderness. Good, he said finally, because breathing matters more than anything else. They remounted and continued riding, the fence line inspection becoming an exploration of the property. Luke showed her the south pasture where he'd moved the cattle in spring, the grove of aspens that turned gold in autumn, the high meadow where wildflowers grew thick enough to walk on in summer. He talked more than Clara had yet heard him talk, his voice carrying something like pride as he described the land he'd built his life around. You love it here, Clara observed as they headed back toward the cabin, the sun now high overhead. It's mine, Luke said simply. Every fence post, every building, every acre. I built it with my own hands, and no one can take it away as long as I'm strong enough to work it. And when you're not strong enough. He was quiet for a moment. That's one reason I need a wife, someone who can help carry the load so I don't break under it. They reached the cabin as early afternoon light slanted through the valley. Clara's body ached from hours in the saddle. Muscles she didn't know she had were screaming protest. But it was good pain, earned pain, the kind that came from doing real work rather than useless decorative activities. You did well today, Luke said as they unsaddled the horses. Most people can't handle that much riding their first time out. I'm tougher than I look. I'm learning that. He carried the saddles to the tack room, Clara following with the bridles. This afternoon I need to check the cattle more thoroughly, look for any signs of illness. You should rest. You'll be sore tomorrow as it is. I can help with the cattle. Clara, Luke turned to face her, his expression serious. I appreciate the willingness, but you need to pace yourself. This isn't a sprint. It's every day, for months, for years. If you burn yourself out in the first week trying to prove something, you'll be useless when I actually need you. The logic was sound, even if Clara's pride rebelled against it. Fine, but I'm not resting. Teach me how to make bread. Luke blinked. Bread? You make good bread. I want to learn how. Clara pulled off her gloves, her fingers stiff with cold. If I'm going to be here, I should know how to make things we need. Something flickered across Luke's face, surprise maybe, or pleasure at her practical approach. All right, bread making it is. The afternoon passed in a warm, flour-dusted haze. Luke was a patient teacher, showing Clara how to mix the dough, how to knead it properly, how to test when it had risen enough. His hands, so large and rough from ranch work, handled the dough with surprising gentleness. My mother taught me, he explained, forming the dough into loaves. Said any person living alone needed to know how to feed themselves properly. Too many men tried to live on jerky and beans and died from it. Clara worked her own dough, imitating his movements. Was she a ranch wife? Farm wife. Similar but different. She was tough. Had to be. 6 children, my father gone for weeks at a time working other people's land. She ran everything while he was away. Luke set his loaves in the oven built into the side of the fireplace. She would have liked you. Why do you say that? You remind me of her, practical, stubborn, not afraid of work or silence. He wiped flour from his hands. The other women who came here, they would have horrified her. All that talk about feelings and romance when there was work to be done. Clara shaped her own loaves, pleased with how the dough felt under her hands, alive, elastic, full of potential. I think I would have liked her too. They worked together through the afternoon, and gradually the cabin began to feel less like Luke's space and more like shared space. Clara washed dishes while Luke mended a bridle. Luke added wood to the fire while Clara swept flour from the floor. Neither spoke much, but the silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the sounds of work and the crackle of burning wood. When the bread finally emerged from the oven, golden and crusty and smelling like heaven, Clara felt a surge of pride entirely disproportionate to the accomplishment. But it was her bread, made with her own hands in her own kitchen, not following someone else's rules or trying to meet someone else's standards. Just practical, honest bread that would feed them through the coming days. Perfect, Luke pronounced, tapping the crust. You're a natural. Or I had a good teacher. Maybe both. He sliced into one loaf, steam rising from the soft interior. He handed Clara a thick slice, still warm. Welcome to Cedar Creek, Clara, officially. She bit into the bread, tasting salt and yeast and her own competence. And for the second time since arriving, she thought, I'm home. That evening, after a simple supper of stew and fresh bread, they sat by the fire, Luke in a worn armchair, Clara on a bench she'd pulled close to the warmth. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning through the valley with a sound like wolves singing. Tell me about the wolves, Clara said. Real ones, not legends. Luke looked up from the book he'd been reading, something about cattle husbandry, Clara noted. What do you want to know? Everything. You said they're curious about new scents. How curious? Should I be afraid? Cautious, not afraid. They're smart, and they're not naturally aggressive toward humans. Cattle, yes, they'll take a calf if they can. But people? He shook his head. They mostly want to avoid us. Mostly? There's a pack that ranges through this valley. 5 adults, probably some pups by now. I've seen them from a distance. They're beautiful animals. Gray and black, bigger than you'd expect. The alpha is a big male with a white patch on his chest. I call him Ghost. Clara leaned forward. You've named them? Just him. He's different, more curious than the others. I found him watching the cabin sometimes, just sitting on that ridge to the north. Not threatening, just watching, like he's trying to figure out what I'm doing here. Does that bother you? No. Luke set down his book. We're all just trying to survive the winter. Him and his pack, me and my cattle. We've got an understanding. He doesn't take my stock. I don't hunt his family. Has he kept his end of the bargain? Mostly. Lost 1 calf last year, but that was a young wolf, probably not part of Ghost's pack. Could have been a cougar, too. Hard to tell from the kill sign. Luke stood, moving to the window. Come here. Clara joined him, following his gaze out into the darkness. At first she saw nothing but shadows and starlight. Then Luke pointed, and she saw them, eyes reflecting the cabin's lamplight from the ridge he'd mentioned. Not threatening, just watching. That's him, Luke said quietly. Ghost. He's checking you out. Clara stared at the distant eyes, feeling something primal stir in her chest. This was wildness, real and immediate. Not stories or legends, but actual wolves standing less than 100 yards from where she slept. In Boston, this would have been terrifying. Here, it was just another truth about the world she'd chosen. He's beautiful, she whispered. Luke glanced at her with surprise and something that might have been respect. Most people see danger. I see an animal trying to survive, just like us. That doesn't seem dangerous. It seems honest. The eyes disappeared as Ghost moved away, melting back into darkness. Luke turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone who'd last maybe a month before demanding I take them back to town. Someone who'd complain about the work and the cold and the isolation. He paused. Someone who'd try to change everything to make it more like what they left behind. I left behind everything I wanted to change, Clara said. Why would I recreate it here? They stood in the quiet cabin, fire crackling, wind singing outside. 2 people who'd been lonely in different ways, finding unexpected kinship in shared silence. I'm glad you came, Luke said finally. I wasn't sure I would be, but I am. I'm glad I came too. He nodded once, then moved back to his chair and his book. Clara returned to her bench, pulling out the mending she'd noticed earlier, one of Luke's shirts with a torn seam. Neither asked permission or announced intentions. They just settled into the evening's rhythm, two people learning to share space without suffocating each other. Later, as Clara climbed to the loft for her second night at Cedar Creek, she paused on the ladder. "Luke?" "Yes?" "Thank you for teaching me today, for trusting me to be capable." He looked up from his book, his face shadowed in the lamplight. "Thank you for being capable. Makes everything easier." Clara smiled and continued up to her loft, to her borrowed quilt and her narrow bed. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered like diamonds across the black sky. Somewhere out there, Ghost was leading his pack through the winter night. Somewhere out there, the world was continuing its ancient patterns of survival and adaptation. And here, in this cabin, Clara was learning to do the same. She fell asleep to the sound of wind and wolves and Luke turning pages below, and dreamed of bread rising and horses running and a life built on honest silence instead of empty words. The third morning dawned with the kind of cold that made breathing painful. Clara woke to frost patterns on the loft window and the distant sound of Luke already moving below. Her body screamed protest as she tried to sit up. Every muscle she'd used yesterday had stiffened overnight into burning knots of pain. Her thighs ached from riding, her arms trembled from pitching hay, even her hands hurt from kneading bread dough. She heard Luke climbing the ladder, his footsteps deliberate on the rungs. His head appeared at the loft's edge, his expression concerned. "Thought you might need this," he said, holding up a tin cup. Steam rose from whatever was inside. "Willow bark tea. Helps with the soreness." Clara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. The tea was bitter, but she drank it anyway, understanding that this was medicine, not comfort. Luke watched her for a moment, then nodded and descended without another word. By the time she made it down the ladder, moving like an old woman, pride be damned, Luke had breakfast ready. Oatmeal with dried berries and a precious spoonful of honey. More of that bitter tea. And surprisingly, a look of sympathy that somehow didn't feel condescending. "It'll get better," he said as she lowered herself carefully into her chair. "First week is always brutal. Your body's learning new movements. Give it time." "How long did it take you?" "To stop hurting every morning?" Luke considered, stirring his oatmeal. "About 2 months. But I was building the cabin at the same time I was learning to ranch, so maybe I'm not the best measure." Clara forced herself to eat, knowing her body needed fuel even if her stomach was queasy from pain. "What's the work today?" "Nothing for you. You're resting." "Luke, that's not a suggestion." His voice was firm but not unkind. "I've seen people push through soreness like yours and end up injuring themselves badly. Torn muscles, strained backs. Then they're useless for weeks instead of just sore for days. You'll rest today, let the willow bark do its work, and tomorrow you'll be stronger for it." Clara wanted to argue. Every instinct told her she needed to prove her worth, demonstrate that she could handle whatever the ranch demanded. But Luke's logic was sound, and more importantly, she could hear genuine concern in his voice. He wasn't trying to sideline her, he was trying to keep her functional. "Fine," she conceded, "but I can still do indoor work. Mending, cooking, organizing." "That's reasonable." Luke stood, carrying his empty bowl to the wash basin. "I'll be working the south fence line today. Should be back by mid-afternoon. There's salt pork that needs slicing for tomorrow's meals, and I noticed the shelves could use reorganizing. Somehow the coffee ended up next to the lamp oil, which seems dangerous." Clara managed to smile despite the pain. "I'll handle it." "I know you will." He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapping a scarf around his face against the cold. "Fire's banked to last. If it gets too low, just add 1 log at a time. Too much and you'll overload it. And Clara?" He paused at the door. "Don't try to do everything. You're allowed to rest." After he left, the cabin felt different. Not empty exactly, but waiting. Clara moved slowly through her morning, each step a negotiation with her protesting body. She sliced the salt pork with careful precision, her hands remembering her mother's kitchen lessons. She reorganized the shelves logically, dry goods together, tinned items grouped by type, medical supplies separated from food. She mended 2 more of Luke's shirts and darned 3 pairs of socks, her needle moving in the familiar rhythm she'd learned as a girl. The work was meditative, giving her time to think. A week ago, she'd been in Mrs. Fletcher's office, holding a telegram that called her too stubborn. 5 days ago, she'd been terrified Luke would reject her match. Yesterday, she'd learned to feed horses and make bread. And now she was in a cabin 40 miles from anywhere, doing domestic work that somehow felt more important than anything she'd done in Boston's Grand Brownstone. The difference, she realized, was purpose. In Boston, she'd mended clothes to meet social expectations of womanly accomplishment. Here, she mended because Luke needed intact shirts to work safely in harsh conditions. In Boston, she'd organized pantries to demonstrate household management skills. Here, she organized because chaos could mean wasted time or dangerous mistakes when minutes mattered. In gray stone. No softness anywhere, nothing decorative or unnecessary. Just the raw bones of the earth wearing winter like armor. She understood why Luke loved it. A movement on the northern ridge caught her attention. For a moment, Clara thought it was Luke returning early. Then she recognized the gray shape, the fluid gait. Ghost, the wolf Luke had pointed out last night. The animal stood silhouetted against the snow, watching the cabin with that same curious intensity Luke had described. Clara didn't move, barely breathed. This close enough to see individual muscles shifting beneath gray fur. The wolf was magnificent, larger than any dog, with a broad head and intelligent eyes that seemed to assess her through the window glass. This was an apex predator, a killer that could take down prey 3 times its size. And yet Clara felt no fear, only a strange kinship with another creature learning to survive in an unforgiving place. Ghost held her gaze for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then he turned and loped away, disappearing into the tree line with the effortless grace of something utterly at home in wilderness. Clara released her breath slowly, her heart pounding not with fear, but with exhilaration. She'd just locked eyes with a wild wolf through a window. In Boston, this would be a story told at dinner parties, embellished until it became legend. Here, it was just Tuesday afternoon. She returned to her mending with a smile. Luke came back as the afternoon light was starting to fail, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. He looked tired, his face reddened by wind, but his eyes brightened slightly when he saw Clara had dinner preparations already underway. "Smells good," he said, hanging up his coat. "Stew. I used some of the vegetables from the root cellar and the salt pork I sliced this morning." Clara stirred the pot. "I hope that's all right. You didn't give me specific instructions about—" "It's fine. Better than fine." Luke moved to the fire, holding his hands toward the warmth. "You don't need my permission for every decision, Clara. This is your home too. Use what we have as you see fit." "Your home too." The word settled around Clara like a warm shawl. She'd lived in her father's house for 27 years and never once felt it was truly hers. She'd been at Cedar Creek Ranch for 3 days, and Luke was already claiming she belonged here. "Ghost came by today," she said, ladling stew into bowls. "Stood on the north ridge watching the cabin for several minutes." Luke took his seat at the table, his expression interested. "He was checking on you, making sure you belonged here." "And does he think I do?" "He didn't attack, so I'd say yes." Luke's mouth twitched with almost humor. "Ghost is particular about who he tolerates in his territory. The third woman who came here, the one who left in the snowstorm, she tried to shoot him. He never came near the cabin again while she was here. The day after she left, he was back on that ridge." Clara sat down across from him, considering this. "So the wolves judge character?" "Better than most people do." Luke began eating, and for several minutes they were quiet. Then he said, "You did good work today. The shelves make sense now, and those shirts have needed mending for weeks." "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me. It's my work, too." "Still worth saying." He met her eyes. The others didn't see it that way. They saw housework as something they were owed appreciation for, like they were doing me a favor instead of contributing to their own survival. Clara thought about the women who'd come before her, trying to understand what had driven them away. "They wanted romance," she said slowly. "They wanted you to perform gratitude and affection in ways that felt meaningful to them. When you didn't, when you just accepted their work as normal contribution, they felt unvalued." "Is that wrong? Accepting contribution as normal?" "Not wrong, just different." Clara broke bread, using it to soak up stew. "Most women are taught their value comes from being appreciated, from men noticing and praising their efforts. Without that external validation, they feel invisible." Do you need that? The praise and noticing? Clara considered the question seriously. I thought I did. In Boston, I craved it, wanted my father to notice I was smart, wanted suitors to see I had worth beyond appearance. But I think what I actually wanted was to be seen as competent, to have my abilities recognized, not just my efforts. She paused. When you said I did good work today, that mattered. Not because you praised me, but because you acknowledged I was capable. There's a difference. Luke nodded slowly. I can do capable. The other thing, the constant reassurance and appreciation for basic contribution, I'm not built for that. Then we're well matched, because I'm not built to need it. Something eased in Luke's expression, a tension Clara hadn't fully noticed until it released. They finished dinner in comfortable quiet, then cleaned up together with the easy efficiency they were developing. Clara washed while Luke dried and put away. He banked the fire while she swept crumbs from the floor. Small acts of domestic cooperation that felt more intimate than romance because they were so fundamentally honest. That evening, Luke pulled out a worn deck of cards. You play? He asked. My mother taught me, though she claimed card playing was unladylike even as she was teaching me. What did she teach you? Poker, mostly. She said any woman living in a man's world needed to know how to call a bluff. Luke's eyebrows rose. Your mother sounds like she was more than she appeared. She was everything and nothing. Clara took the cards, shuffling them with practiced ease. Everything inside where no one could see. Nothing outside where everyone looked. I think it killed her, that contradiction. They played several hands, and Clara was surprised to discover Luke was good. Not just competent, but genuinely skilled. He read her tells, bluffed sparingly but effectively, and never gloated when he won. It was the kind of card playing that required intelligence and observation, qualities Clara was learning Luke possessed in abundance despite his rough exterior and minimal speech. You're better than the ranch hands I used to play with in Missouri, Luke admitted after Clara won her fourth hand. They relied on luck. You rely on strategy. My mother said luck is just probability wearing a mask. Better to understand the odds. Smart woman. She was, just trapped. Clara dealt the next hand. Do you ever feel trapped here? Luke picked up his cards, arranging them thoughtfully. Opposite. I feel free here in ways I never did working for other men. Even the isolation feels like freedom. Freedom from expectation, from judgment, from having to perform civility I don't feel. But lonely. But lonely, he agreed, though less so since you arrived. The admission was casual, delivered while studying his cards, but Clara felt its weight. This was Luke offering connection in the only way he knew how. Honest and unadorned, without performance or pretense. Less lonely for me, too, she said quietly. They played cards until the fire burned low and Clara's eyes grew heavy. When she finally climbed to the loft, her body still ached, but less viciously than that morning. The willow bark tea and rest had helped, just as Luke said they would. She was learning to trust his expertise, to understand that his years alone hadn't made him ignorant, but rather deeply knowledgeable about survival's practical requirements. The next morning, Clara woke to shouting. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, disoriented by the darkness. Below, Luke was moving fast, his boots hitting the floor with urgent thuds, more shouting. Not Luke's voice, but someone else's, distant and desperate. Clara scrambled down the ladder, still in her nightdress, to find Luke pulling on his coat with grim efficiency. What's happening? Henderson. Luke grabbed his rifle from above the door. Something's wrong with his stock. Stay inside. Lock the door. I can help. Stay inside. His voice was harder than she'd yet heard it, leaving no room for argument. Then he was out the door, moving into the pre-dawn darkness at a run. Clara pressed her face to the window, watching his lantern bob across the valley toward the Henderson property. She could see other lights now, the Henderson house probably, and what looked like their barn. Even from this distance, she could hear cattle bellowing, an urgent, terrified sound that made her skin crawl. Minutes stretched into a quarter hour, half an hour. Clara paced the cabin, torn between obeying Luke's instruction and the desperate need to know what was happening. Finally, she compromised. She dressed in her warmest clothes and boots, lit a lantern, and stood on the porch where she could see better while still technically following orders. The sky was just beginning to lighten when she saw movement returning across the valley. 2 figures this time, Luke and someone else, moving more slowly. As they drew closer, Clara recognized the second man as Mr. Henderson, the rancher who'd sent her back to town. He was limping badly, one arm wrapped around his midsection. Clara threw open the door, ignoring Luke's earlier command. "What happened?" "Cougar," Luke said shortly, helping Henderson up the porch steps. "Got into his barn, spooked the cattle. Henderson tried to drive it off and got clawed for his trouble." Henderson looked terrible, face gray with pain, coat torn and bloody on one side. Clara immediately shifted into action, years of helping her mother tend to household injuries suddenly relevant in new ways. "Get him to the chair by the fire," she ordered, moving to the shelves where Luke kept medical supplies. "How deep are the wounds?" "Deep enough?" Luke eased Henderson into the chair while Clara gathered clean cloths, whiskey, needle, and thread. "He'll need stitching." Henderson looked at Clara with recognition and something like shame. "You're the bride I sent back." "I am." Clara knelt beside him, carefully peeling away his shredded shirt to reveal 3 long gashes across his ribs. They were still bleeding, though not arterially. "This is going to hurt." "Already hurts. It's about to hurt worse." Clara poured whiskey over the wounds, and Henderson hissed through clenched teeth. She worked quickly, cleaning the gashes with the efficiency her mother had taught her. "Luke, I need better light." Luke brought 2 lanterns close while Clara threaded her needle. She'd stitched fabric countless times. She'd even stitched a gash on her father's hand once when he'd slipped with a letter opener. But this was different, deeper, more serious, with a man's life potentially depending on her competence. "You know what you're doing?" Henderson asked, his voice tight with pain. "I'm about to find out." Clara met his eyes. "Hold still." She began stitching, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Henderson gripped the chair arms hard enough to make the wood creak, but he didn't cry out. Clara worked methodically, closing each gash with small, neat stitches her mother would have approved of. Behind her, Luke watched silently, his presence solid and reassuring. "Why'd you come back for him?" Clara asked Luke as she worked, needing conversation to steady her nerves. "He's not your responsibility." "He's my neighbor. That makes him my responsibility." Luke's voice was matter-of-fact. "Out here, you help who needs helping. Otherwise, nobody survives." Henderson made a sound that might have been agreement or just pain. Clara finished the last stitch and bandaged the wounds with clean cloth, wrapping them tightly to prevent further bleeding. "Done," she announced. "You'll need to keep these clean and dry. Change the bandages daily. If they show signs of infection, redness, heat, pus, you'll need a doctor." "Nearest doctor is in town," Henderson said weakly. "Then don't let them get infected." Clara stood, washing blood from her hands in the basin. "You can rest here for a few hours before riding back. Luke, help me get him onto the bench. He needs to lie flat." They settled Henderson on the bench Clara had been sitting on during card games, covering him with a spare blanket. He was asleep within minutes, exhausted from pain and blood loss. Clara stood over him, her hands still trembling slightly from the aftermath of emergency care. "You did good," Luke said quietly. "Those stitches will hold." "My mother taught me. She said any woman might need to tend injuries with no doctor available." Clara moved to the wash basin, scrubbing her hands more thoroughly. "I never thought I'd actually need the skill." "That's frontier life. You need every skill you can get." Luke started making coffee, the familiar ritual somehow grounding after the chaos. "Henderson's lucky. That cougar could have killed him easily. Probably would have if he hadn't had a pitchfork handy." "Did he kill it?" "No. Drove it off, but it'll be back. Cougars don't give up easy when they've found a food source." Luke's jaw tightened. "I'll need to track it today. Make sure it's moved on from both our properties." Clara felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "That's dangerous." "Everything out here is dangerous, but cougars near the ranch are more dangerous than tracking one through the mountains." He poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Clara. "I'll take the rifle and scout. Be back by nightfall." "I'll come with you." "No." "Luke." "No." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not risking you on a cougar hunt. You're too valuable to lose over my pride." "Then you're too valuable to lose over yours," Clara shot back. "If something happens to you out there alone, then you'll handle the ranch until someone comes to check on us. You know enough now to keep things running for a few days." Luke's voice was gentle but immovable. "Clara, I appreciate that you want to help, but this is my job, my expertise. Let me do it." Clara wanted to argue more, but she understood his logic. She'd been ranching for 4 days. He'd been doing it for 5 years. Her pride demanding she help didn't outweigh his experience knowing she'd be more liability than asset on a dangerous hunt. "Fine," she conceded, "but you'd better come back." "I intend to." Something softened in his expression. "I've got reasons to come back now." He left an hour later after Henderson woke and insisted on riding home despite Clara's medical protests. Luke saddled Scout and loaded his rifle, checking his ammunition with practiced care. Clara stood on the porch, watching him prepare, memorizing the sight of him in case it was the last time. "Clara?" Luke swung into the saddle, looking down at her. "If I'm not back by full dark, don't come looking. Ride to town and get help. Understand?" "I understand." "Promise me." "I promise." He nodded once, then urged Scout into motion. Clara watched him ride toward the tree line where the cougar had likely fled, her heart in her throat. When he disappeared into the forest, she felt his absence like a physical wound. The day stretched endlessly. Clara threw herself into work, needing distraction from worry. She mucked out the stalls, fed the horses and cattle, gathered eggs from the angry hens. Every task took twice as long as when Luke did it, but she managed, driven by the need to prove she could handle the ranch alone if necessary. By mid-afternoon, she'd done everything she could think of. The animals were fed, the cabin was cleaned, bread was rising for tomorrow. She sat at the table with mending, but her hands were too restless to hold a needle steady. She tried reading one of Luke's books, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. Finally, she just stood at the window, watching the tree line, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in. The sun touched the western mountains. Shadows stretched across the valley. Clara lit lanterns, preparing for the possibility she might need to ride for help. She saddled Rosie, just in case. She packed supplies, water, food, extra ammunition for the rifle she barely knew how to use. Full dark arrived. No Luke. Clara stood on the porch, staring into the darkness, trying to decide if she should honor her promise or break it to go searching. Her practical mind said, "Keep your word. He knows these mountains and you don't. You'll get lost or hurt and make everything worse." Her heart said, "He needs you. Go find him." She was still debating when she heard it, hoofbeats moving steadily through the darkness. A moment later, Scout emerged from the tree line, and Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. Luke rode into the lamplight looking exhausted but whole. No visible injuries, no blood except what looked like old stains on his coat. He dismounted slowly, moving like every muscle ached. "You're all right," Clara breathed, meeting him at the porch steps. "I'm all right." Luke handed her Scout's reins. "Can you tend him? I need to sit before I fall." Clara led Scout to the barn, her hands shaking with relief as she unsaddled him and rubbed him down. The horse was tired but sound, and she took her time caring for him, using the familiar work to steady herself. By the time she returned to the cabin, Luke had shed his coat and boots and was slumped in his chair by the fire. "Did you find it?" Clara asked, bringing him water. "Found it. Tracked it 12 miles into the high country. It's not coming back. Territory's too good up there. Plenty of elk and deer. Won't bother with cattle when it has easier prey." Luke drank deeply, then looked at her. "You handled things here?" "Everything's fed and watered, bread's rising. Henderson came by around noon to check his wounds. They look clean, no infection signs yet." "Good." Luke closed his eyes, his head falling back against the chair. "I'm sorry for worrying you. You did your job, just like you said you would." Clara sat on her bench, allowing herself to fully feel the fear that had gripped her all day. "But Luke? Next time something dangerous needs doing, we talk about it first. We decide together whether the risk is worth it." He opened his eyes, studying her. "You're not my responsibility to protect at the cost of everything else." "And you're not my responsibility to protect at the cost of everything else," Clara countered. "But we are responsible to each other. Partners share risk, share decisions. That's what you said you wanted. Someone to share the load. Let me do that." Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're right. I'm not used to considering anyone else's opinion, but you're right. Next time, we decide together." Thank you. They sat in tired silence as the fire burned low. Finally, Luke stirred, forcing himself upright. I should tend the horses one more time before bed. Make sure I already did. Clara met his surprised look. Final check an hour ago. Water's full, hay's distributed, stalls are mucked. Everything's done. Something crossed Luke's face. Surprise. Gratitude. Something deeper that Clara couldn't quite name. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. Because this is my ranch too, remember? My work, my responsibility. She stood, moving to the ladder. Get some rest, Luke. You've earned it. She climbed to the loft, leaving him by the dying fire. Through the floorboards, she heard him moving slowly, banking the fire, checking the door latch, settling into his bedroll. The sounds of a man who was beginning, finally, to trust he wasn't alone. Clara pulled the quilt, his mother's quilt, up to her chin and listened to the silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that came from shared space and mutual understanding. The kind that said, I see you, you see me, and neither of us has to perform or pretend. Tomorrow they'd formalize the marriage with Judge Morrison when he came for his circuit rounds. Tomorrow they'd sign papers that made legal what was already becoming real. But tonight, Clara understood that the real marriage had already begun, not with romance or ceremony, but with stitching wounds and tracking cougars and trusting each other to handle what needed handling. This was partnership. This was what she'd crossed half a continent to find. And lying in the darkness of her loft, listening to Luke's breathing slow into sleep below, Clara Hawthorne smiled and thought for the third time since arriving. I'm home. The next week passed in a rhythm that felt both new and ancient. Clara's body adapted to ranch work with surprising speed, her muscles developing the specific strength needed for pitching hay and hauling water. Luke taught her to read weather signs, the quality of light that meant snow was coming, the way cattle clustered before storms, the silence that preceded wind. She taught him to appreciate organized storage and hot meals that went beyond pure sustenance. They developed systems, small domestic arrangements that made the work flow more smoothly. Luke woke first and started fires. Clara made coffee while he tended the first round of animal care. They ate breakfast together, planned the day's work, then separated to their tasks. Lunch was quick and practical. Dinner was slower, a time to sit and talk or be comfortably silent, depending on what the day had demanded. Judge Morrison arrived on a Tuesday, riding a bay mare through light snow. He was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, the kind of frontier judge who understood law was sometimes less important than justice. Luke, he greeted, dismounting, Mrs. Fletcher said you'd finally taken a wife. Clara Hawthorne. Clara, this is Judge Morrison. Clara shook his hand, noting his assessing gaze. He was measuring her, she realized, trying to determine if she'd last longer than the others. Pleased to meet you, Judge. Come inside. Coffee's hot. They settled around the table while Morrison pulled papers from his saddlebag. This is straightforward. Marriage certificate, property rights documentation since you're joining an established ranch, and witness statements. I'll need both your signatures and then I'll witness and file with the territory when I get back to town. Clara read through the papers carefully, her mother's voice in her head reminding her to always know what she was signing. The language was clear. She and Luke would be legally married with shared property rights to Cedar Creek Ranch. In the event of Luke's death, she'd inherit everything. In the event of her death, he'd maintain ownership as he had before. This is fair, she said, picking up the pen. Luke signed first, his handwriting the same careful script she'd seen in his original letter. Then Clara signed, her own hand steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. Clara Hawthorne became Clara Carver with simple strokes of ink on paper. Well then, Morrison said, countersigning as witness, by the power vested in me by Wyoming Territory, I pronounce you legally married. Luke, you may kiss your bride. Luke looked at Clara. Clara looked back. Neither moved. Morrison laughed. Or not. Plenty of time for that later. Let me tell you both. I've married 16 couples in this territory. 12 of them were mail order arrangements like yours. Of those 12, 4 have already ended in separation or annulment. Of the 8 remaining, at least 5 are miserable. The couples who last are the ones who understand marriage out here isn't about romance. It's about survival and partnership and honest respect. That's what we're building, Clara said. I can see that. Morrison tucked the papers away. Luke, you're lucky this time. She's got sense and strength. Don't waste it. I don't intend to. Morrison stayed for lunch, sharing news from town and nearby ranches. The Zimmerman place had lost cattle to the early cold. The Henderson spread was recovering from the cougar attack, though Henderson himself was apparently still bitter about the whole situation. Mrs. Fletcher had successfully matched 2 more couples, both of whom seemed reasonably content. She asks about you, Morrison told Clara. Wants to know if you're surviving or if she should expect you back in town by spring. Tell her I'm thriving, Clara said firmly, and I'll thank her properly when we come to town for supplies. After Morrison left, Clara stood on the porch watching him ride away. Behind her, Luke emerged from the cabin, coming to stand beside her. You all right? He asked. I'm married. Clara turned to look at him. Legally, officially, married to a man I've known for 8 days. Having second thoughts? No, just processing. She smiled slightly. In Boston, I'd have had a year-long engagement, months of planning and fittings and social events. Here it's just signatures and coffee with a judge. You prefer one over the other? Clara thought about the Boston weddings she'd attended, the elaborate ceremonies, the expensive gowns, the performances of happiness that often concealed profound unhappiness. She thought about this morning. Simple papers, simple words, simple honesty. I prefer this, she said. This is real. Luke nodded slowly. Then, hesitantly, he reached for her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. Clara laced her fingers through his, and they stood together watching the valley and the sky and the endless Wyoming horizon. Thank you, Luke said quietly, for staying, for trying, for not running when things got hard. Thank you for letting me be capable instead of decorative. You're more than capable, Clara. You're exactly what this place needed. He squeezed her hand gently. What I needed. They stood in the cold afternoon, 2 people who'd been lonely in different ways, learning that sometimes the best partnerships were built not on passion, but on honest recognition of mutual need and mutual strength. That night, after dinner and evening chores, Luke pulled out a small wooden box Clara hadn't seen before. My mother's, he explained, setting it on the table. She left it to me when she died, said I should give it to my wife when I found one worth keeping. Clara opened the box carefully. Inside was a delicate chain with a small silver locket, tarnished with age but beautiful in its simplicity. Luke, I can't. You can. You're my wife now, legally and actually. He picked up the locket, opening it to reveal 2 faded photographs, a stern-looking couple from another generation. My grandparents. My mother wore this every day of her life. She wanted it passed to a woman who understood that marriage was work, not romance. That partnership mattered more than passion. Claire's throat tightened as Luke fastened the chain around her neck. The locket settled above her heart, warm from his hands, heavy with history and trust, and something that felt dangerously close to belonging. Thank you, she whispered. Welcome to the family, Clara Carver. Clara Carver. Not Clara Hawthorne anymore. Not the stubborn daughter who'd disappointed Boston society. But Clara Carver, ranch wife, partner to a man called Wolf, woman who'd chosen wilderness over civilization and found herself more civilized for it. She touched the locket, feeling its weight, and realized she'd never worn jewelry that meant something before. In Boston, her jewels had been displays of wealth. This was different. This was inheritance, legacy, trust. This was home. The silver locket became Clara's talisman through the weeks that followed, a constant reminder that she'd chosen this life, and it had chosen her back. She wore it every day, tucked beneath her work shirts where it pressed cool against her skin during morning chores and warmed gradually through the day's labor. Sometimes she'd catch Luke looking at it during meals, his expression carrying something soft that he'd never quite put into words. She didn't need him to. The fact that he'd given her his mother's most precious possession said everything his limited vocabulary couldn't. Winter deepened across Cedar Creek Valley with a fury that made Boston's cold seem like gentle suggestion. The temperature dropped so low that water left outside froze solid within minutes, Snow fell in waves, sometimes light dustings that melted by noon, other times blizzards that buried fences and trapped them inside for days. Clara learned to read the sky with the same attention she'd once given to Boston's social calendars, understanding that survival depended on anticipating weather's moods. During one particularly vicious storm, they were confined to the cabin for 3 days straight. Clara worried the isolation would feel suffocating, that Luke's silence would become oppressive in such close quarters. Instead, she discovered a strange comfort in the forced proximity. They developed a rhythm that required few words, Luke maintaining the fires while Clara managed their limited food supplies, stretching meals to ensure they'd last if the storm continued. They worked on separate tasks in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing observations about the wind's direction or the snow's density, small practical exchanges that felt more intimate than poetry. On the second night of confinement, Clara was mending by lamplight when Luke suddenly spoke from his chair. "Tell me about your mother." Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. Luke rarely asked personal questions, preferring to let information emerge naturally over time. The directness of it caught her off guard. "Why?" she asked, not defensively, just curious. "You mention her often. Little things, how she taught you to stitch wounds, to read weather in people's faces, to call bluffs. She sounds like she was more than the ghost you described." Luke set down the harness he'd been mending. "I want to know who she actually was." Clara set aside her mending, gathering her thoughts. Outside, wind shrieked around the cabin's corners, but inside the fire crackled warmly, creating a small pocket of safety against the storm. "Her name was Eleanor," Clara began. "Eleanor Blackwood, before she married. She came from a good family, not wealthy, but respectable. Educated, which was unusual for her generation. She could read Latin and Greek, understood mathematics, had opinions on everything from politics to philosophy." Clara smiled sadly. "My father courted her because she was beautiful and accomplished. He married her because she made him look sophisticated, and then he spent 28 years systematically crushing everything that made her interesting." "How?" Luke's voice was quiet but intent. "Small cuts, mostly. Dismissing her opinions in company, redirecting conversations when she showed too much knowledge, telling her that men preferred women who listened rather than spoke. She tried to fight it at first. I remember being very young and hearing them argue behind closed doors. But eventually she just stopped. Stopped arguing, stopped offering opinions, stopped being visible." Clara touched the locket at her throat. "She saved all her real self for private moments with me, teaching me things my father would have disapproved of, warning me not to make her mistakes." "But you almost did," Luke observed. "You said you nearly let Boston society shape you the same way." "I tried to be what they wanted, spent years trying." Clara picked up her mending again, needing her hands occupied. "But I couldn't manage it. Every time I forced myself to be quiet in a conversation, I felt like I was drowning. Every time I pretended to be less intelligent than I was, something inside me screamed. I kept thinking of my mother, of how she'd looked in those final years, like a faded photograph of herself. I couldn't become that." Luke was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "My mother was the opposite. Never quiet, never small. My father tried once to tell her women shouldn't have opinions about ranch management, and she laughed in his face. Told him she'd been running that ranch since she was 12 and he'd do well to listen to someone with more experience." A slight smile crossed his face. He never made that mistake again. "You loved her very much." "I did. Still do, I suppose, even though she's gone." Luke stood, moving to add wood to the fire. "She would have liked you, would have appreciated that you're not afraid of work or silence, would have respected that you left Boston rather than let it kill you slowly. I wish I could have met her." "Me too." Luke returned to his chair, but instead of picking up his mending, he just sat looking at Clara. "You remind me of her in some ways. Not appearance. She was tall, broad-shouldered, built for hard work. But the spine, the refusal to be made small, the way you face problems head-on instead of hoping they'll resolve themselves." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's just truth." Luke's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he'd simply observed weather patterns rather than offered profound compliment. You're strong, Clara. Stronger than you probably know. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving the valley buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Digging out became a monumental task that consumed days of brutal labor. Clara and Luke worked side by side, shoveling paths to the barn, the chicken coop, the cattle feeding stations. Clara's arms screamed protest, her back ached, and her face burned from windburn despite the scarf she kept wrapped around it. But she pushed through, driven by Luke's steady example and her own stubborn refusal to be the weak link. "How did you manage this alone?" she gasped during a brief rest, her breath clouding white in the frigid air. "Took twice as long. Sometimes I just tunneled to the animals instead of clearing full paths. Did what was necessary, nothing more." Luke leaned on his shovel, surveying their progress. "Having you here makes everything easier. We've cleared in 2 days what would have taken me 5 alone." "Partnership," Clara said, echoing the word he'd used before. "Partnership," Luke agreed. That evening, as they thawed by the fire with coffee that had never tasted better, a howl rose from the northern ridge. Clara recognized it immediately. Ghost, calling to his pack. Within moments, other voices joined him, creating a chorus that was both eerie and beautiful. "They're celebrating the storm's end too," Luke said, moving to the window. "Easier hunting now. Deer will be struggling through deep snow, vulnerable." Clara joined him, watching the ridge where she knew the wolves gathered, even though she couldn't see them through the darkness. "Do you think they know we're here? Really know, I mean. Not just that the cabin exists, but that we're inside?" "Ghost knows." Luke's voice carried certainty. "He's been watching closer lately. Curious about you, probably, trying to figure out if you're different from the others who came and left." "How would he know I'm different?" "You smell different, sound different, move through the world differently." Luke glanced at her. "Animals notice things people miss. Ghosts can probably sense you're more settled, less frightened, that you belong here in ways the others never did." The howling continued, rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed almost like language. Clara found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm, entranced by the wild music. "I used to be terrified of wolves," she admitted. "In Boston, they were monsters from fairy tales, dangerous, evil. But hearing them now—" She trailed off, searching for words. "They're just family," Luke finished. "Taking care of each other, surviving together. No different from us, really." "No different from us," Claire repeated softly, and realized it was true. She and Luke were their own pack of two, learning to survive together in an unforgiving place. The wolves probably understood that better than any human could. As January gave way to February, the work shifted slightly. The cattle needed more attention, their feed carefully monitored to ensure they'd survive until spring grass emerged. Luke taught Clara to check each animal for signs of illness or injury, to recognize when one was struggling and needed intervention. She learned to read bovine body language, to distinguish between normal cold weather clustering and the more concerning behavior that indicated a sick animal. One morning, they found a cow lying in the snow, clearly in distress. She was one of the older animals, and Clara had developed a particular fondness for her gentle disposition. "She's calving," Luke said immediately, dropping to his knees beside the cow. "Early. Wasn't expecting this for another month. Must have miscalculated, or she got bred earlier than I thought." "What do we do?" "Help her. The calf's coming wrong. I can tell by how she's straining. If we don't intervene, she'll die and the calf with her." Luke was already rolling up his sleeves despite the cold. "Clara, I need you to hold her head. Keep her calm. This is going to hurt her, and she might try to fight." Clara positioned herself at the cow's head, gripping her halter and murmuring soothing nonsense. The animal's eyes were wild with pain and fear, and Clara felt her own fear rise in response. She'd never done anything like this. In Boston, birth was something that happened behind closed doors, managed by doctors and midwives, certainly not something respectable women participated in directly. But she wasn't in Boston anymore. She was at Cedar Creek Ranch, and this animal's life depended on her staying calm and useful. Luke worked with focused intensity, his hands disappearing inside the cow as he tried to reposition the calf. The cow bellowed and thrashed, and Clara held on with all her strength, her voice continuing its steady stream of soothing words, even as tears froze on her cheeks from cold and sympathetic pain. "Almost there," Luke muttered. "Come on, Mama. Work with me." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Clara's arms trembled from holding the cow's head. Her voice grew hoarse from talking, and her heart pounded with fear that they'd lose both animals despite their efforts. Then suddenly, Luke made a triumphant sound. "Got it. The calf's repositioned. She can do the rest herself now." He moved back, and Clara loosened her grip slightly, watching as the cow's body took over with powerful contractions. Within minutes, a small, wet calf slid into the snow. It wasn't moving. "No," Clara breathed. Luke was already there, clearing the calf's nose and mouth, rubbing its body vigorously with handfuls of clean snow. "Come on. Breathe, breathe." For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the calf gasped, coughed, and drew its first shuddering breath. The mother cow, exhausted but alert, immediately began licking her baby with long, thorough strokes. Clara sat back in the snow, her legs suddenly unable to support her. They'd done it. Against odds, against early timing, against a difficult birth, they'd saved both animals. "You did good," Luke said, coming to sit beside her. His arms were bloody to the elbows. His face was gray with cold, but his eyes were bright with success. "That was hard work, Clara. Most people would have panicked." "I was panicking. I just didn't stop working." Luke laughed, a rare full laugh that transformed his face. "That's the definition of courage. Being terrified and doing what needs doing anyway." They sat together in the snow, watching the new calf struggle to its feet on shaky legs while its mother encouraged it with gentle nudges. Life asserting itself against cold and difficulty and danger. It felt like a metaphor for everything Clara was learning about frontier existence. "What will you name her?" Clara asked. Luke looked surprised. "The calf? She's special, early, difficult birth, but she survived. She deserves a name." "I don't usually name them. It makes it harder when—" Luke stopped, seeing Clara's expression. "But I suppose this one could be an exception." "What do you suggest?" Clara watched the calf nurse for the first time, finding its mother's warmth and nourishment. "Hope. Let's call her Hope." "Hope." Luke tested the word. "All right, Hope it is." They helped the mother and calf to the barn, getting them settled in a protected stall with fresh straw and extra feed. The mother was exhausted, but seemed to be recovering well, and Hope was already showing the stubborn determination to live that would serve her well in Wyoming winters. Back at the cabin, Clara scrubbed her arms clean while Luke did the same. They were both exhausted, filthy, and running on pure adrenaline. Clara's hands wouldn't stop shaking. "First time?" Luke asked gently. "First time." Clara sank into her chair, accepting the whiskey Luke poured for her. She normally didn't drink spirits, but today seemed to warrant an exception. The liquid burned going down, but it steadied her nerves. "Does it get easier?" "Not easier, just more familiar. You learn to manage the fear instead of letting it manage you." Luke sat across from her, his own hands wrapped around his whiskey glass. "But you should know, what you did today matters. That cow would have died without your help. That calf wouldn't exist. You saved them, Clara, not me. You. We saved them, together." "Together," Luke agreed, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that they were becoming something more than two people sharing space. They were becoming a unit, a partnership where each made the other stronger. That night, Clara lay in her loft thinking about hope, about new life arriving against odds, about how survival sometimes meant helping each other through impossible situations. She thought about Luke's hands, so capable and gentle despite their size and roughness. She thought about her own hands, which had held a suffering animal steady while life fought its way into the world. In Boston, her hands had poured tea and embroidered pillows and performed all the delicate, useless tasks that demonstrated feminine refinement. Here, her hands saved lives. Here, her hands mattered. She touched the locket at her throat and whispered a thank you to Eleanor Blackwood, who died teaching her daughter that there was more to life than being decorative. That strength mattered more than beauty. That capability trumped propriety every single time. The next weeks brought a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Clara and Luke moved through their days with the easy coordination of longtime partners, anticipating each other's needs without excessive communication. Luke would start to reach for a tool and find Clara had already handed it to him. Clara would begin preparing for a task and discover Luke had already handled the preliminary work. They were learning each other's patterns, adapting to each other's strengths and weaknesses, creating something more efficient than either could be alone. The neighboring ranchers began to notice. When Luke and Clara rode to the Zimmerman place to check on the older couple after another storm, Martha Zimmerman pulled Clara aside while the men discussed cattle prices. "You're still here," Martha observed, her weathered face showing surprise and something like approval. "Luke's other brides never made it this long." "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said simply. "Good. That man needs someone with spine." Martha poured coffee with hands gnarled by arthritis and decades of hard work. "His mother, Catherine, was my best friend. Died too young, like most ranch women do. But she loved this land, and she loved her son, and she worried he'd end up alone because he couldn't pretend to be something he wasn't." "He shouldn't have to pretend." "No, he shouldn't. But most women can't accept a man who doesn't perform for them. They need the pretty words and the romantic gestures, even when there's work to be done and winter to survive." Martha set the coffee cups on the table. Catherine used to say Luke needed someone who understood that love shows itself in actions, not words. Someone who'd see how he sharpened her knives without asking, or how he'd saddle her horse before she mentioned riding, or how he'd save her the last bit of sugar even when he wanted it himself. Clara thought about all the small things Luke did, banking the fire so she'd wake to warmth, setting aside the softest blanket for her use, making sure the coffee was hot when she came in from morning chores. Things he never mentioned or called attention to, just quiet acts of care woven into daily routine. "I see it," Clara said quietly. "I see how he shows care." "Then you're smarter than the others." Martha patted her hand. "Hold on to that man, Clara. Hold on to this life. It's hard, but it's honest. That's worth more than all the romance in the world." The conversation stayed with Clara as they rode home through the afternoon cold. She glanced at Luke beside her, his profile stark against the white landscape, and felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. Not love, exactly. Not yet. Maybe never in the theatrical way Boston romantics would define it. But something deeper and more durable. Respect. Trust. Affection built on competence and honesty rather than performance. "Martha says you're like your mother," Clara said, breaking their comfortable silence. "In what way?" "You show care through actions instead of words." Luke was quiet for several strides of the horses. "Words are easy. Actions cost something. If I'm going to care about someone, I want it to cost me. Want them to know I'm choosing to make their life easier even when it makes mine harder. Like getting up early to start the fires so I wake to warmth." He glanced at her surprised. "You notice that?" "I notice everything you do, Luke. The way you save me the last of the butter. The way you always take the worst cut of meat so I get the better one. The way you mended my good skirt when I tore it, even though you claim not to be good at sewing." Clara smiled. "You show care in 100 small ways every day. I'd be blind not to see it." Luke's hands tightened on the reins, and Clara could see the muscles in his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "No one's ever noticed before. The others, they wanted grand gestures. Flowers when there weren't any flowers to pick. Poetry when I don't know poetry. They wanted me to say I loved them, even when love wasn't what we had. But the small things, the daily things, those didn't matter to them. They mattered to me." Clara urged Rosie closer until her leg brushed against Luke's. "They matter more than all the poetry in the world." They rode the rest of the way home in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Charged with acknowledgement and understanding, with feelings neither of them had words for but both recognized in the other. That evening, Luke did something he'd never done before. After dinner, after evening chores, after their usual quiet routine, he stood from his chair and extended his hand to Clara. "Dance with me," he said. Clara blinked in surprise. "There's no music." "Don't need music, just need to hold you." His voice was gruff, almost embarrassed, but his hand remained steady. "You said actions matter more than words. This is me showing you what I don't know how to say." Clara took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. There was no music, No proper dance floor, just worn wooden planks and the crackle of fire, and two people learning to move together. Luke's hand settled at her waist, large and warm. Clara's hand found his shoulder, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. They swayed in the lamplight, not really dancing, just holding each other and moving slightly to a rhythm only they could hear. "I'm not good at this," Luke murmured. "You're perfect at this," Clara corrected. They moved together as snow began falling outside, as wind sang around the cabin's corners, as the fire burned low and warm. No words passed between them, because none were needed. This was communication of a deeper kind, bodies learning trust, boundaries softening, walls coming down one brick at a time. When they finally separated, Luke didn't let go of her hand immediately. He stood looking down at her, his expression carrying something vulnerable and uncertain. "Clara, He stopped, struggling with words he'd never been good at forming. "What I mean is—" Clara rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, just a brief press of lips against rough beard. "I know, I feel it too." Relief flooded his face. "You do?" "Yes. We don't need to name it or define it or rush it. We just need to keep doing what we're doing, building something real, something honest, something that matters." Luke nodded slowly, then surprised her by pulling her into a proper embrace, his arms wrapping around her completely. Clara melted into it, resting her head against his chest and hearing the steady thump of his heart. This was safety. This was home. This was everything Boston's grand romances had promised and never delivered. They stood holding each other while the fire died to embers and the night deepened around them. Two people who'd been lonely in different ways, finding that sometimes the best love was the kind that grew slowly from respect and partnership, rather than exploding fully formed from passion. Finally, reluctantly, they separated. Luke banked the fire while Clara checked the door and windows. They moved through the evening routine one final time, but something had shifted. A wall had come down. A bridge had been built. "Good night, Clara," Luke said as she climbed the ladder. "Good night, Luke." She paused halfway up, looking back at him. "Thank you. For the dance. For showing me instead of telling me. Thank you for seeing it. For understanding what I don't know how to explain." Clara continued to her loft and settled under the quilt, touching the locket that had brought her into this family. Below, she could hear Luke settling into his bedroll, the familiar sounds of him preparing for sleep. But tonight, those sounds carried new meaning. Tonight, they weren't just two people cohabitating out of practical necessity. They were becoming something more. And Clara, lying in the darkness with a smile on her face, thought about how she'd crossed 1,800 miles expecting nothing and found everything that mattered. March arrived with false promises of spring that turned into brutal late-season storms. During one particularly bad week, the temperature plummeted and stayed below zero for days. The cattle suffered despite Luke and Clara's best efforts, and they lost 2 head to the cold. Luke took it hard, his jaw tight with self-recrimination as they buried the animals in ground so frozen it took hours to dig adequate graves. "I should have moved them to better shelter sooner," he said, his voice flat with exhausted guilt. "Should have anticipated how bad it would get." "You can't control the weather, Luke. We did everything we could." Clara's hands ached from digging. Her body was numb with cold, but she kept working beside him. Sometimes loss happens despite best efforts. Catherine would have anticipated it. She had better instincts for weather. Catherine had years of experience you're still building. Stop comparing yourself to an impossible standard. Clara drove her shovel into the frozen earth with more force than necessary. "We're doing fine. The ranch is fine. Losing 2 animals is terrible, but not catastrophic. We'll recover." Luke looked at her then, his eyes red-rimmed from wind and what might have been unshed tears. "You're right. I know you're right, but losing stock feels like failure. Failure is giving up. This is just setback." Clara moved closer, gripping his arm through his thick coat. "We're partners, remember? That means when you struggle, I hold you up. When I struggle, you hold me up. Right now you're struggling, so let me carry some of this." Something in Luke's expression cracked, and he pulled Clara into a fierce embrace, his face buried in her shoulder. She held him while he shook. Whether from cold or grief or relief at being understood, she couldn't tell. It didn't matter. She just held him and let him be human and vulnerable in ways the frontier usually forbade. That night, for the first time since Clara had arrived, Luke climbed the ladder to her loft. Can I? He started, then stopped, looking uncertain. Come here, Clara said, pulling back the quilt in invitation. Luke removed his boots and lay down beside her, and Clara wrapped them both in the quilt his mother had made. He was warm and solid and still trembling slightly. Clara curved against him, offering comfort with her presence, and felt his breathing gradually slow and deepen. Thank you, he whispered into the darkness. For what? For not expecting me to be invincible, for letting me be weak sometimes. You're not weak. You're human. There's a difference. Clara found his hand under the quilt and laced her fingers through his. Besides, we're partners. That means I get to see all of you, not just the strong parts. Luke's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a small gesture that carried enormous weight. I'm falling in love with you. I don't know how to do it right, and I'll probably disappoint you 100 different ways, but it's happening whether I'm good at it or not. Clara's heart lurched in her chest, not with surprise, but with recognition. I'm falling in love with you too. The real you, not some romanticized version. The man who shows care through actions and struggles with loss and dances without music because he doesn't know how else to communicate. That's enough? The real me is enough? The real you is everything. They lay together as the wind howled and the cabin creaked, and the night pressed cold against the windows. Two people who'd been told repeatedly they were too much or not enough, discovering they were exactly right for each other. In the morning, they woke tangled together, and Luke's first words were, Is this all right, me being up here? More than all right. Clara stretched, feeling muscles protest but not minding. Though we should probably discuss sleeping arrangements going forward. What do you want? Clara considered. In Boston, this would be scandalous, discussing sleeping arrangements so frankly with a man, even her husband. But this wasn't Boston, and frankness had served them better than propriety ever could. I want you here, every night, not because I need protection or because I'm afraid, but because I sleep better knowing you're close. Because partnership means sharing space and warmth in lives, not maintaining artificial boundaries. Relief washed over Luke's face. I want that too. Wanted it for weeks, but didn't want to presume. Then it's settled. Tonight you bring your bedroll up here, and we'll figure out permanent arrangements later. They sealed the agreement with a kiss, their first real kiss, soft and tentative, and carrying the weight of everything they'd built together. When they finally separated, both were smiling. We should get to work, Luke said, though he made no move to leave the warm nest of quilts. We should, Clara agreed, also not moving. They lay there a few minutes longer, stealing time from the demanding day, learning the feel of waking up together. Finally, necessity drove them from the loft and into the cold morning air. But as they moved through morning chores, Clara caught Luke watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. And when their hands brushed passing tools, the contact felt deliberate and precious. They were building something rare. Not a fairy tale romance, but something more durable. Partnership tempered by hardship, affection deepened by honesty, love that grew from seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway. That evening, Luke carried his bedroll up to the loft, and they rearranged the space to accommodate two people. It required creativity and compromise. Luke was large and the loft was small. But they made it work, because making things work was what they did best. As they settled in for their first official night sharing the space, Clara thought about the telegram that had started everything. Too stubborn, it had said, as if stubbornness was weakness rather than strength, as if refusing to be made small was flaw rather than survival. She touched the locket at her throat and smiled. That stubborn woman had crossed half a continent and found a man who needed exactly what she had to offer, fire and fight and fierce determination to build something real. What are you smiling about? Luke asked, pulling her close. Just thinking about how I ended up here. How Mr. Henderson called me too stubborn, and Luke Carver said that fire was exactly what he needed. Luke chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest where Clara's head rested. Henderson's an idiot. Your fire is the best thing that ever happened to this ranch. Our ranch, Clara corrected. Our ranch, Luke agreed and kissed the top of her head. Outside, wolves sang on the ridge. Inside, two people who'd been lonely in different ways held each other and listened to the wild music and understood they'd found something worth keeping. The wolves' song faded into the night, and Clara fell asleep wrapped in Luke's arms, feeling more secure than she'd ever felt in her father's guarded Boston brownstone. Safety, she was learning, had nothing to do with locked doors and social propriety. It had everything to do with trust and partnership and knowing someone would face the darkness beside you rather than demanding you face it alone for the sake of maintaining appearances. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as if winter was unwilling to relinquish its grip on Cedar Creek Valley. The snow began melting in earnest by mid-March, turning the ranch into a muddy chaos that made every task twice as difficult. But beneath the mud, Clara could see green beginning to emerge. Tiny shoots of grass pushing through dead vegetation, wildflowers preparing to bloom, life reasserting itself after months of dormancy. She and Luke worked from dawn until well past dusk, taking advantage of longer daylight hours to accomplish everything winter had delayed. Fences needed comprehensive repairs after months of snow damage. The barn required maintenance, new boards where old ones had rotted, reinforcement of the roof, general cleaning, and organization. The cattle needed to be moved to spring pasture, counted, checked for injuries or illness that might have gone unnoticed during the worst of winter. It was exhausting, relentless work. Clara's body ached constantly. Her hands developed new calluses over old ones, and she fell asleep each night too tired to dream. But there was profound satisfaction in it, watching the ranch come back to life under their combined efforts, seeing tangible results of their labor, understanding that every fence post straightened and every animal tended was an investment in their shared future. One morning in early April, Clara was working in the garden plot she'd claimed behind the cabin, turning soil that had been frozen solid for months, preparing to plant vegetables that would sustain them through the next winter. Luke had ridden out to check the eastern fence line, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the satisfying physical labor of cultivation. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the approaching horse until it was quite close. Clara straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and recognized the rider immediately. Mrs. Fletcher, looking considerably more weathered than she had in January, pulled her mare to a stop at the garden's edge. "Mrs. Carver," the older woman said, her tone carrying equal parts surprise and approval. "Or should I still call you Miss Hawthorne?" "Mrs. Carver is fine." Clara pulled off her work gloves, noting how different her hands looked now, strong, capable, scarred from honest labor. "This is an unexpected visit. Is something wrong?" "On the contrary, I'm making my spring rounds, checking on the matches I made over winter, seeing who lasted and who didn't." Mrs. Fletcher dismounted with a slight groan. "I won't lie to you, I didn't expect to find you still here. Luke's track record suggested you'd be gone by March at the latest." Clara gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. Coffee's hot, and I've got fresh bread from this morning's baking." Once they were settled at the table with coffee and thick slices of bread, Mrs. Fletcher studied Clara with unconcealed curiosity. "You look different, stronger, more settled." "I am different. This place changes you if you let it." Clara sipped her coffee, remembering the frightened, desperate woman who'd sat in Mrs. Fletcher's office 4 months ago. Or maybe it just lets you become who you actually are instead of who everyone expects. Poetic way of putting it, Mrs. Fletcher spread butter on her bread with deliberate care. "Luke treating you well?" "Luke is exactly what he promised to be. Honest, hardworking, a good partner. Nothing more, nothing less." Clara met the older woman's eyes steadily. "You were right about him. He doesn't perform or pretend, but he shows care in ways that matter more than performance ever could." "And you're happy?" Clara considered the question seriously. Happy seemed too simple a word for what she felt. Satisfied, certainly. Purposeful, absolutely. Challenged and exhausted and more alive than she'd ever been. But happy in the uncomplicated, carefree sense? Perhaps not. Yet she wouldn't trade this complicated satisfaction for any amount of simple happiness. "I'm building something real," she finally said. "Something that matters. Whether that constitutes happiness depends on your definition, but by mine, yes. I'm happy." Mrs. Fletcher nodded slowly, something like respect crossing her weathered features. "You're only the second bride I've sent to Cedar Creek who's made it past 3 months. The first was Catherine, Luke's mother, years before my time here. She lasted 40 years before fever took her. I hope you make it just as long." "I intend to." Clara refilled their coffee cups. But Mrs. Fletcher, I need to understand something. Why did you send the others if you knew they wouldn't last? Why set Luke up for repeated failure? The older woman was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if reading prophecies in the dark liquid. Because I hoped one of them would surprise me, would prove stronger than they appeared, would understand that Luke wasn't a project to fix, but a man to partner with. She looked up, her eyes sharp. And because Luke kept requesting matches despite the failures, he wanted companionship badly enough to risk repeated rejection. Who was I to deny him hope? Even knowing it would likely end in disappointment, hope has to start somewhere. Even impossible hope is better than resignation. Mrs. Fletcher set down her cup. Besides, I was right eventually. You're still here building something with him. That makes all the previous failures worth it. Luke returned around midday, and his surprise at finding Mrs. Fletcher at their table was almost comical. He stood in the doorway, muddy and tired, looking between the two women with obvious wariness. "Abigail," he said cautiously, "didn't expect to see you out here." "Spring rounds, checking on my matches." Mrs. Fletcher stood, gathering her coat. "I'm pleased to report that this one seems to be working out considerably better than your previous attempts. Clara's different." Luke's voice carried simple certainty. "She's not trying to change me or fix me or make me into something I'm not. She just is. And that's enough." "More than enough," Clara corrected gently. Mrs. Fletcher looked between them, and something soft entered her expression. "Well, I'll leave you to your work. But Luke, you should know, the whole territory is talking about the Wolf of Cedar Creek finally finding a bride who can handle him. You're becoming a success story. Don't care what the territory thinks. Only care what Clara thinks." Luke moved to stand beside Clara's chair, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "But I appreciate you bringing her here. Best match you ever made." After Mrs. Fletcher departed, Clara and Luke stood on the porch watching her ride away. Luke's arms settled around Clara's waist, pulling her against his side. "You told her we were happy," he said quietly. "We are, aren't we?" "Yes, but I didn't realize you felt that way." "You never said." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at his sun-weathered face. "I don't need to say everything I feel. Sometimes showing is enough. But since you need to hear it, yes, Luke, I'm happy. Happier than I've ever been, even though the work is brutal and the isolation is real, and nothing about this life is easy." "Because?" "Because it's honest. Because you're honest. Because every day I get to be fully myself instead of some diminished version that fits other people's expectations." Clara rose on her toes to kiss him, tasting coffee and morning work, and the particular flavor that was uniquely his. "Because I chose this, and you chose me, and we're building something neither of us could build alone." Luke held her close, his face buried in her hair. "I love you, Clara Carver. Not sure I'm saying it right, but I mean it with everything I have. You're saying it perfectly, and I love you too, the real you, not some idealized version. The man who shows care through actions and struggles to find words, and needs me as much as I need him." They stood holding each other while the spring sun warmed their backs, and the valley stretched around them, alive with possibility. This was partnership in its truest form, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but two people choosing each other every day through the ordinary, difficult work of building a life together. As April progressed into May, the ranch transformed completely. Grass grew thick and green in the pastures, wildflowers carpeted the meadows in riots of color, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, its voice constant and musical. Clara's garden flourished under her careful attention, neat rows of vegetables pushing through dark soil, promising abundance to come. The cattle thrived on spring grass, and Hope, the calf born too early in the snow, grew sturdy and strong, following her mother with increasingly confident steps. Luke taught Clara to ride more seriously, taking her on longer excursions across the property and into the surrounding wilderness. She learned to read tracks in soft earth, to distinguish between deer trails and cattle paths, to recognize the signs that predators had passed through. The land became familiar territory rather than frightening unknown, and Clara found herself developing the same deep attachment Luke felt, understanding why he'd built his life here, why he'd endured loneliness rather than leave, why this harsh place felt more like home than any civilized town could. One evening, in late May, they rode to the high meadow Luke had mentioned during their first fence line inspection. It was everything he'd promised, a secret valley carpeted in wildflowers, surrounded by protective ridges, beautiful enough to make Clara's throat tight with emotion. "This is where I come when I need to think," Luke admitted as they dismounted. "When the ranch gets overwhelming or I need to remember why I chose this life. Something about this place makes everything clear." Clara walked through the flowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush, columbine and forget-me-nots, a dozen other varieties she couldn't name. It's perfect. Like the world showing off. Like the world reminding us there's beauty in the difficult things. That survival and beauty can coexist. Luke stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "I wanted to bring you here because I've been thinking about the future, about what we're building and where it might lead." Clara's heart quickened. "What have you been thinking?" "That I want this to be permanent. Want you to be permanent. I know we got married out of practical necessity, but it's become more than that, at least for me." Luke turned to face her fully. "I want children with you someday. Want to build a family that lasts generations. Want to make Cedar Creek Ranch something we pass down to sons and daughters who understand hard work and honest living." Tears pricked Clara's eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming recognition that she wanted exactly the same thing. "I want that too. Want babies who learn to ride before they can run properly. Want to teach daughters they can be strong and capable. Want to build something that outlasts us." "You're sure? It won't be easy. Raising children out here with no neighbors close by, no easy access to doctors or schools. You'd have to teach them yourself, handle medical emergencies alone sometimes when I'm working distant sections of the ranch." "I'm sure. Because we'll do it together, the same way we do everything else. Partnership, remember? Sharing the load, holding each other up when things get hard." Clara squeezed his hand. "Besides, I think our children will be extraordinary. Stubborn enough to survive anything, honest enough to see the world clearly, strong enough to build lives that matter." Luke pulled her close, and they stood together in the flower-filled meadow, making promises about futures they couldn't predict but were determined to create. This was faith in its most practical form, not blind optimism, but conscious choice to believe in something worth building. "When?" Clara asked eventually. "When do we start trying for a family?" "No rush. Let's give ourselves another year to fully establish the ranch, to build up reserves in case pregnancy and infancy make work difficult for you. Want to be smart about this, not reckless." Luke's hand moved to rest against her stomach, large and warm through her shirt. "But knowing it's coming, knowing you want it too, that changes everything, gives all this work even more meaning." They stayed in the meadow until sunset painted the sky in impossible colors, then rode home through the gathering dusk. The wolves were singing again, and this time Clara joined her voice to theirs. Not howling, exactly, but calling out to the wilderness, claiming her place in it. Luke laughed and added his voice to hers, and together they made their own wild music, announcing to the valley that they belonged here, that they were building something permanent, that they refused to be driven away by hardship or isolation or any of the forces that had defeated others before them. Summer arrived with heat that was less brutal than winter's cold, but equally demanding. The work shifted again, maintaining irrigation for the garden, watching for drought stress in the pastures, dealing with insects and the occasional predator testing their defenses. Luke taught Clara to shoot properly, and she discovered she had a natural aptitude for marksmanship. They held target practice sessions in the evenings, and Clara felt fierce satisfaction when her shots grouped tighter than Luke's, earning his genuine admiration rather than wounded pride. "You're better than me," he admitted after one particularly impressive round. "Steadier hands, better eye for distance. If we ever have trouble with predators, you should be the one taking the shot." Most men wouldn't admit that, would feel threatened. I'm not most men, and your competence doesn't diminish mine. It just means we're stronger together. That's partnership. Luke cleaned the rifles with practiced care. Besides, my ego isn't so fragile that I can't acknowledge when someone's better at something. That's how you learn and improve. It was one of thousands of small moments that reinforced Clara's love for this man who'd rather be honest than impressive, who celebrated her strengths instead of feeling diminished by them, who understood that real partnership meant both people bringing their full capabilities to bear rather than one pretending weakness to make the other feel stronger. In July, neighbors began stopping by more frequently, not just Henderson checking his healing wounds or the Zimmermans making courtesy calls, but other ranchers and their families drawn by curiosity about the woman who'd finally tamed the wolf of Cedar Creek. Clara found herself hosting impromptu gatherings, serving coffee and fresh-baked bread to weathered men and work-worn women who assessed her with the same careful attention they'd give to livestock at market. She passed their tests, apparently, because the visits became more frequent, more relaxed. The women shared practical advice about preserving food and managing households in isolation. The men discussed cattle prices and water rights and the politics of territorial governance. Clara contributed to both conversations, her opinions respected rather than dismissed, her competence acknowledged rather than resented. "You're good with them," Luke observed after one particularly long afternoon of socializing. "Better than I ever was. They actually like you. They respect us. That's different than like, and more valuable." Clara was washing dishes from the gathering, her hands moving through familiar motions. "They see we're building something solid, that we're not going to fail like your previous attempts. That makes us trustworthy, which matters more than likable in a place like this. Still, you've done more to integrate us into the community in 6 months than I managed in 5 years. Clara turned to face him, drying her hands. "That's because you didn't need community the same way I do. You're comfortable with isolation, but I grew up in a city, surrounded by people even when I was lonely. I need some human contact, some connection beyond just the two of us. Not much, but some." "Does that bother you, that I'm comfortable alone?" "No, because you're not demanding I match your comfort level. You're letting me build the connections I need while still maintaining the solitude you prefer. That's compromise. That's partnership." Clara moved to stand beside him at the window, watching the last neighbors depart. "We don't have to be identical to work well together. We just have to respect each other's needs." Luke pulled her against his side, his arms solid around her waist. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. People just make it complicated by insisting their partner be everything, instead of accepting they're simply enough." As summer deepened, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The signs were subtle at first: unusual fatigue, slight nausea in the mornings, a heightened sensitivity to smells. But by August, there was no denying the life growing inside her. She sat at the table one morning, her hands pressed against her still flat stomach, trying to comprehend the enormity of it. Luke emerged from the barn, and Clara watched him approach through the window. He moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in his body and his world, and she felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. This man would be the father of her child. Their baby would have his strength and her stubbornness, his honesty and her fire. "You look serious," Luke said, washing his hands before joining her at the table. "Something wrong?" "Something right, actually." Clara took his hand, pressing it against her stomach. "I'm pregnant, about 2 months along, I think." Luke's hand flattened against her, his eyes widening with something between joy and terror. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor confirming, but yes, I'm sure. All the signs are there." For a moment, Luke simply stared at where his hand rested. Then he was pulling Clara into his arms, holding her with a gentleness she hadn't known he possessed, his face buried in her hair as his shoulders shook with emotion. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, his voice rough with feeling. "We're actually going to have a family." "We are." Clara held him just as tightly, feeling the magnitude of what they'd created. "Are you ready for this?" "No, absolutely not. Terrified, actually." Luke pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "But we'll figure it out together, same as everything else. Partnership, right?" "Partnership," Clara agreed, and kissed him to seal the promise. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Clara's body changed gradually, her stomach rounding, her breasts growing tender, her energy levels fluctuating wildly. Luke became almost comically overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, until Clara firmly informed him that pregnancy wasn't illness and she was perfectly capable of continuing ranch work until her body told her otherwise. They compromised, as they always did. Clara took on lighter tasks, tending the garden, managing the chickens, handling indoor work and meal preparation. Luke handled the heavier labor, though he taught Clara everything she'd need to know in case she had to manage alone if something went wrong during calving season. They prepared the loft for the baby, building a small cradle from cedar wood and lining it with soft blankets Clara stitched during increasingly limited daylight hours. Winter returned, but this time Clara knew what to expect. She'd survived one Wyoming winter and felt confident she could survive another, even pregnant. The work was harder with her changing body, but she adapted, learning to work smarter rather than harder, to ask for help when needed rather than pushing herself to dangerous limits. On a brutally cold night in late January, almost exactly 1 year after Clara had first arrived at Cedar Creek, her labor began. Luke rode through darkness and snow to fetch Martha Zimmerman, the closest thing to a midwife the territory possessed. Clara labored through the night while Martha coached and Luke held her hand and the fire burned bright against the cold. The pain was immense, worse than anything Clara had imagined, testing the limits of her considerable strength and stubbornness. But she'd learned something during her year at Cedar Creek, that survival often meant enduring the unendurable, that strength wasn't the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain stop you from doing what needed doing. "Push, girl," Martha commanded, her weathered hands gentle but firm. "Your baby's almost here, just a little more." Clara pushed with everything she had, her body doing what it had been designed to do, and with a final tremendous effort, brought new life into the world. A baby's cry filled the cabin, angry and strong and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Martha announced, wrapping the infant in clean blankets. "Strong lungs, good color, all her fingers and toes. You did well, Clara." Luke's face was wet with tears as Martha placed the baby in Clara's arms. She was tiny and red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be Luke's forest green. Clara stared at this impossible creature she'd created, feeling love so overwhelming she could barely breathe. "She's perfect," Clara whispered. "She's ours," Luke corrected, his finger gently touching the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant's fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength, and Luke made a sound between laugh and sob. "Look at that. She's got your stubbornness already." They named her Catherine Eleanor Carver, Catherine for Luke's mother, Eleanor for Clara's, honoring the women who'd shaped them into people capable of building this life. Little Catherine, Katie, they called her almost immediately, had her father's coloring and her mother's determined expression, and from her first moments she made it clear she would not be an easy child. "She's going to be a handful," Martha predicted, watching Katie's fierce grip on Luke's finger. "Got that look about her. The stubborn ones always do." "Good," Clara said, exhausted but smiling. "Stubborn women survive. Stubborn women build things that last." Luke met her eyes over their daughter's head, and Clara saw everything they'd built together reflected in his expression. Partnership and respect, affection and honest love, the kind of family neither had believed they'd find but both had desperately needed. As winter slowly gave way to spring again, Clara adjusted to motherhood with the same pragmatic determination she'd applied to ranching. Katie was demanding, feeding constantly, sleeping in unpredictable bursts, requiring attention that made regular work nearly impossible. But Luke stepped into fatherhood with surprising grace, taking on more than his share of ranch labor, while Clara focused on keeping their daughter alive and healthy. They moved through the months in exhausted coordination, stealing moments of connection between endless baby care and necessary work. Luke would hold Katie while Clara cooked, or Clara would strap the baby to her back while doing lighter chores, or they'd simply sit together in the evening with Katie sleeping between them, too tired to talk, but content in their shared silence. On a warm day in May, when Katie was 4 months old and beginning to show her own personality, fierce and curious and absolutely certain of her place in the world, Clara carried her out to the high meadow. Luke had ridden ahead with supplies for a rare day of rest, and Clara found him sitting among the wildflowers, watching the valley that was their kingdom. "There you are," he said, standing to take Katie from her arms. The baby giggled at her father, her small hands reaching for his beard. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." "Just took my time." Wanted Katie to see everything, the creek, the cattle, the mountains. Clara settled beside him, accepting Katie back as the baby began rooting for food. Wanted her to understand this is her inheritance, all of this, the land, the work, the life we're building. Luke watched Clara nurse their daughter, his expression carrying such tenderness it made Clara's chest ache. You know what today is? Should I? 1 year since we got married, officially, legally married by Judge Morrison. Luke pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. I made you something. Wasn't sure I'd finish in time, but I did. Clara unwrapped the cloth one-handed, revealing a wooden box carved with intricate designs, wildflowers and mountains, wolves and horses, tiny human figures that she recognized as the three of them. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every detail carefully rendered in wood that had been sanded smooth as silk. Luke, this is beautiful. When did you make this? Evenings, after you fell asleep. Took me months. He looked almost embarrassed by the admission. I wanted to make something permanent, something that showed how I felt even though I'm not good with words, something Katie could have someday, to remember where she came from. Clara traced the carved figures with her free hand, her vision blurring with tears. This is the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me, more than all the flowers and poetry in the world. Because it's real. It's honest. Luke leaned over to kiss her forehead, then Katie's. Like us. Like everything we've built. They sat together in the flower-filled meadow, Clara and Luke and Katie, the family that shouldn't have worked but did. The mail-order bride who'd been sent back for being too stubborn. The cowboy everyone called Wolf because he preferred isolation to pretense. The baby born in winter who'd grow up strong and capable and absolutely certain of her worth. Below them, Cedar Creek Ranch stretched across the valley. Fences mended, buildings maintained, cattle grazing peacefully, chickens scratching in their yard. A year of their combined labor, visible proof that partnership could build something enduring. And beyond the immediate ranch, the endless Wyoming wilderness, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving, demanding everything from those who chose to live within it. Do you ever regret it? Clara asked quietly. Marrying me? Taking on a wife who argues and has opinions and refuses to be decorative? Luke's laugh was soft and genuine. That telegram said you were too stubborn, that your fire made you unmarriageable. But Clara, your fire is exactly what I needed. What this place needed, what Katie will need as she grows up here. He took her hand, lacing their scarred, work-roughened fingers together. I regret nothing. You're the best thing that ever happened to Cedar Creek Ranch. We're the best thing, Clara corrected. All three of us together. Partnership. Partnership, Luke agreed. Katie finished nursing and let out a satisfied burp that made both her parents laugh. Clara settled the baby against her shoulder, looking out across the valley that was their home. A year ago, she'd been terrified and desperate, discarded like unwanted freight, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming to Wyoming territory. Now she sat in a meadow full of wildflowers with a husband who showed love through carved wood and a daughter who'd inherit strength from both her parents. And Clara understood that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as rejection. Mr. Henderson had sent her back for being too stubborn. Luke Carver had said her fire was exactly what he needed. And in the space between those two assessments, Clara had found not just survival, but true belonging. She'd found partnership and purpose, honest work and honest love, a life built on capability rather than performance. The wolves began their evening song from the northern ridge. Ghost and his pack, still ranging through the territory, still surviving through partnership and family bonds. Clara smiled, recognizing kindred spirits. They were all just trying to survive in a harsh place, all building something worth protecting, all understanding that strength came from connection rather than isolation. Tell me something, Luke said, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. If you could go back to that train station in January, knowing everything that would happen, the hard work, the brutal cold, the isolation, the struggles, would you still get on that wagon with me? Clara didn't need to think about her answer. In a heartbeat, every single time. Because this, she gestured to the ranch, to Katie, to Luke himself, this is real. This matters. This is exactly what I crossed 1,800 miles to find. What's that? A place where stubborn women are valued instead of dismissed, where fire is needed instead of extinguished, where partnership means building each other up instead of one person making themselves smaller. Clara leaned against Luke's shoulder, feeling his solid warmth, a place where I can finally breathe. They sat together as the sun descended and the wolves sang and the stars began emerging in the darkening sky. Three people who'd found each other against odds, who'd built something rare and precious from honest work and honest love, who'd taken rejection and loneliness and transformed them into family and purpose. The mail-order bride who'd been sent back for being too stubborn had found a cowboy who said her fire was exactly what he needed. And together, they'd built something that would last for generations, not because it was easy, but because it was real. Not because it was romantic, but because it was honest. Not because they'd changed to suit each other, but because they'd chosen each other exactly as they were. Some fires weren't meant to be tamed, Clara had learned. Some fires were meant to burn bright and fierce, illuminating the darkness, warming those brave enough to draw close, forging strength from raw materials through intense heat and pressure. She was that fire. Luke was the steady structure that housed it safely. And Katie would grow up understanding that being too much was never a flaw. It was simply being exactly enough for the life you chose to build. As darkness settled fully over Cedar Creek Valley, Clara closed her eyes and listened to her family's breathing. Luke's deep and steady, Katie's quick and light, and understood that she'd finally found what her mother had searched for but never achieved. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Not just existence, but purpose and partnership and love that showed itself through actions rather than empty words. The stubborn fire that Boston society had tried to extinguish was burning brighter than ever, and Clara Carver, wife, mother, partner, rancher, had no intention of letting it dim. Not now. Not ever. This was her life. This was her family. This was her fire, and she would tend it carefully, feed it faithfully, and pass it on to her daughter and her daughter's daughters, teaching them that sometimes the greatest strength is simply refusing to be made small. Sometimes the greatest love is the kind that grows slowly from respect and partnership rather than exploding fully formed from passion. And sometimes the woman everyone calls too stubborn is exactly stubborn enough to build something that lasts forever.